Well, I suppose one of the first things to say is that we are in sort of a long and illustrious line of people to talk about Alexander, the life and adventures of Alexander. I mean, you know, beyond Michael Wood and Dan Carlin, even even Arian writing in probably like the 160s, 170s, one of the first things he says is, why am I writing yet another history of Alexander? He's saying that in Roman times. There's so many out there.
Yeah.
So, but it's a perennial thing. People are just interested in it constantly, all through the ages.
Yeah, I think the most I think the most attractive thing about the story of Alexander is it was real. It really happened. And it didn't seem likely at the time either. That's the thing. Like the people after looking at the events of the Greco-Persian Wars, which weren't a success for the Greeks really, at least not the Athenians. Um, if you were to mark that down in like a game of Rome Total War, uh, stomping through Greece, getting a bunch of client states, and then burning down the capital of your enemies, you could mark that as a win. Even if you didn't manage to hold the province afterwards, you could still say, well, that was at least mission successful. Um, and like the great thing to come out of it is the Battle of Thermopylae, which is a defeat for the Greeks. So
Mm.
the people forget that in retrospect, the Persian Empire was this giant evil empire that could summon up, I mean, in their minds, millions of men and just stomp any other kingdom into the ground. So people forget like the scale of the accomplishment that Alexander managed, especially as he didn't even stop at the Persian Empire; he kept going. So it's one of those things where it's genuinely heroic and totally unprecedented. And I mean, I can't think of an example where the same thing happened since either. So I think the uniqueness of what happened is one of the most interesting and appealing parts of it.
Yeah, yeah. I was listening to a lecture just the other day, the guy talking about that. If you just look at the general trend, sort of the general way things were going, the Persian Empire was just until Alexander was in the ascendancy. It was,
Mm.
it was on the way to just being, a Rome type civilization that might last for 1,000 years or more. But then Alexander comes along and snuffs it out in sort of 5 years flat. You know, and how that is just a real fulcrum upon which civilization or history turned, and you can't deny it.
Yeah. This is another thing as well. People get the impression that the Persian Empire was like some ancient thing, and it's really not. The Persian Empire itself. I mean, it's based on foundations that were created by the Assyrians, which was an ancient empire. And then in the 7th century BC, they were defeated by the Babylonians and the not the Sassanids, sorry, the coalition of the Babylonians and the Medes and the Persians. And then the Babylonians were overtaken by the Persians, who effectively conquered an empire like around the Babylonians and then defeated the Babylonians as Cyrus took Babylon through treachery, not through outright conquest. And then they just kept expanding until they reached the Ionian Greek states and took them as well. And so and then into Europe. So and also by the sort of fifth century BC, they had Egypt as well. So they essentially were the masters of the world, but they hadn't been the masters of the world forever. That's
Mhm.
the thing.
Yeah, yeah. Like when Alexander and his men do get to Babylon, I always, well, not always, but I'm shocked to be reminded that the Babylonians consider themselves sort of liberated from Persian rule. You sort of
Yes.
you think of Babylon as just a Persian city, but it's not. The Persians had only been there for I think 200 years at
Yeah.
that point.
And the Greeks didn't even know this either, as we saw in the Anabasis of Xenophon, when they're marching past these ancient Assyrian cities that had been destroyed by the Persians. They assumed they were Persian cities because they just didn't know.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's just such a great story that it ripples through time, and that it's not really been bettered, like you say. There's lots of people. It's one of those things that historians do where they try and rank who's the best commander ever,
Oh
and
yeah, oh
it
yeah,
always comes out Alexander, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, the same old names. But I did hear someone say that well, Alexander's record is pretty much 23 for zero, 23
yeah,
big engagements for massive battles and not lost when he's actually on the field.
yeah.
And only really Napoleon comes close, but Napoleon did still lose a few times.
He did, he did, and then you
So
get like these. sorry, then these sort of top 10 general lists. During my 20s, I spent a lot of time on history forums. Man, there are, every single day is a new. So who are the top 10 generals in history? And so it's very well trodden ground.
Yeah.
I'm actually a big proponent of Subadai though, one of the Mongol generals. I think he is genuinely one of the best who have ever existed as well.
Was that the one that raided deep into Europe?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Again, never lost a battle. But I mean, there are actually quite a few generals who actually never lost a battle, and the difference, I think, and the thing that I think is the important thing to think about there is the resources they started with when they began their military careers. Because Subadai started with a giant Mongol army, and he rose through the ranks to become a commander, and so he had this like really, really expert and really rugged army that had a sort of natural inbuilt advantage because they came from the steppes of Central Asia, where it just made them tough as nails. And the Mongols themselves were aware of this, which is why after conquering China, they started sending their sons back to be raised in Mongolia because they realized that raising them in China was making them soft. And so like he starts with a natural advantage. And it's the same with Alexander, in fact. Alexander starts with Philip of Macedon's army. And Philip of Macedon had created an amazingly good army. So, anyone with these sort of natural advantages could have done probably quite well either way.
Yeah, Alexander definitely inherits the sort of a well-oiled killing machine.
Yes.
Just a quick line from Arian himself. He says, quote, Alexander, about whom I write, held first place in the profession of arms. Another quick one was, there has never been another man in all the world, of Greek or any other blood, who by his own hand succeeded in so many brilliant enterprises. Lots of historians there's loads of quotes like that you can find where everyone seems to be in more or less agreement. But I think you're absolutely right that he owes a great deal to Philip's accomplishments. And I've heard people say that if Alexander had been just a failure in life, just had been weak and not really achieved anything, Philip II of Macedon, his dad, may well have had the epithet great on his own for the amount he achieved.
Yeah, I always I don't know whether we want to go to Philip's assassination immediately, but I always thought about the sort of counterfactual of if Philip had not been killed, how would he have done against the Persian Empire? And I can't help but feel that he would have done very well himself.
Yeah, I suspect he would have done really quite well. Yeah, he might not have had quite the energy that Alexander had, but there's no reason why. I mean, that, as I say, a well-oiled machine. There's no reason why it wouldn't have done at least as well. There's only a handful of times, I think, when it was Alexander's personal, his mind, his eye, if you like, on the field that really changed the course of things. And you can't discount that. I don't want to discount that, but who knows what Philip might have achieved. But I think he would have done quite well nonetheless. I mean, to talk about Alexander, just how much he spans history. I remember as a kid hearing about maybe Attila the Hun or Genghis Khan or something, and asking the question, probably like loads of kids all through the centuries have, has anyone ever conquered the whole world? And being told no, and then saying, well, has anyone come close? Who's the person who's come closest? And being told, well, there's Alexander. Me being like, Alexander who?
Yeah.
and being told, Alexander the Great, the King of Greece, 300 years before Christ. And who isn't interested in that? I remember thinking, well, I need to know more about this Alexander fellow. I'd like the cut of his jib immediately.
Yeah.
Even if you do grow up to find out he's quite dark in many ways.
Well, I mean, yes. I think that you can't achieve these kinds of heights without also making mistakes, no matter how great you are, and being but a mere flesh and blood mortal as well, which I think is important to remember. Because I mean, the Alexander's legend is just so large through history at this point. I mean, like you say, even in Arian's time, in like what was it, 160 BC or something, that he wrote this.
Yeah, around then, yeah.
Yeah, even then there was no need for another history of Alexander, and yet since then, I dread to think how many have been written. I mean, Alexander is a hero from the Quran. He's a hero in Greek and Persian legends. He's a hero in just Western the Western canon. In
the book of in Daniel, I think he appears.
Yes, yep. So you can't you can't overstate Alexander's impact on world history, I think.
Yeah, one of the things always springs to mind me is the story that Caesar, Julius Caesar, was said to have stood at the foot of a statue of Alexander and wept at how
Yes.
pathetic his career and achievements were compared to Alexander. I mean, that kind of
Yes.
says it all.
Yeah, but the thing is, right, so this is one of those things where Julius Caesar, when I think he was 33 or something,
Yeah, he was a
he
late bloomer.
exactly, he was a late bloomer. But when he was 33, he stood in front of the statue of Alexander and wept because he had achieved nothing compared to Alexander. Which, I mean, like, don't beat yourself up. Most people have achieved nothing compared to Alexander, Julius. And
Yeah, it's a
he
pretty
was,
high mark to reach.
yeah, but he was also a prince. Like, Julius Caesar came from really minor Roman aristocracy that had fallen on hard times. So the fact that Julius Caesar raised himself up to such great heights himself, heights that are comparable to Alexander, is actually, in my opinion, probably a bigger achievement, because especially given how bloodthirsty the politics in Rome were at the time, it was brutal stuff. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't any less brutal in the Macedonian court. But Alexander had the natural advantage of being Philip's adult son. And that's a massive, massive advantage in these conditions.
Yeah, yeah, you can definitely say that a lot of it, he had to roll the dice and take a lot of gambles,
Oh, yeah.
but a lot of it was still given to him on a plate. I mean, he inherited
Yeah.
the state and the army and the prestige and the name and everything. But we'll see when Philip is assassinated, Alexander immediately has to put down local rebellions
Oh,
or the whole of
yes.
Greece still. But I suppose if we can talk about Alexander, you've got to really talk about Philip in a little bit of detail. The most we know about Philip is really from the orations of Demosthenes, who hated him
Yeah.
as a bitter enemy. And it seems that Philip sort of reorganized Macedonian society more or less in order to create this, as I say, this well-oiled killing machine, this phalanx that is much more maneuverable and more sophisticated than any earlier phalanx. And I'm sure we'll get into it more than once, but the tactics of using a phalanx to sort of pin an enemy and then have a cavalry ride them up from the flank and roll them up and doing that, but just in a really much more sophisticated way than had been done before. And that's all really down to Philip.
Right. Yeah. Let's not jump into the military tactics of it quite quickly enough, because the politics of it is genuinely fascinating. So, and the thing is, all of this, it's all a contiguous thread that goes through the history of how Philip became a military genius himself. He piggybacks off of the back of, I think it's Epaminondas of Thebes. I think it was Epaminondas who was one of the great generals of Thebes who defeated the Spartans and ended the Spartan hegemony over Greece. And so Epaminondas does this by loading the Theban phalanx with incredibly deep ranks on the right hand side, I think it was, or the left hand side, which no, on the left hand side, to counteract the position of honor, the right hand side of the Spartan phalanx, where they have their best men. And at the Battle of Leuctra, I think it was, they end up smashing the Spartans, and like half of the Spartiates die. And so this is the end of Spartan power over Greece, which essentially was in all but name at that point anyway. But this was the genuine sort of like smashing of the Spartan legend, the myth of invincibility of Sparta. And Epaminondas, and I can't remember the other general now off the top of my head because I didn't think I'd have to bring him up. But Philip is what we would call a hostage, but the term hostage doesn't have the same connotations. For example, like Pyrrhus of Epirus was a hostage in Egypt, but what that meant is he was in the royal court and he was raised by Ptolemy after Alexander. This was, and what that means, he's raised to be an aristocrat in the Egyptian court. So he's taught how to hunt, how to fight, how to command troops. And it's a way of creating long-term alliances. So these young men are raised with love for the household that they've been in, as well as when they go back to their own. So it creates a long-term familial alliance. And this was the same thing with, and absolutely common for Greek aristocracy to do this. And so Philip of Macedon is raised in the court of Epaminondas in Thebes, and then ascends to his throne in Macedon and then ends up conquering Greece. And as you say, Demosthenes is a particularly interesting one because at the time the Athenians had quite significant influence. For example, in the Amphipoli, and what the fingers? What are they called?
Oh, I can't remember. I know what you mean though.
The three fingers at the top of Greece. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. But where Thessalonica is, there are essentially these three fingers, and there were gold mines there. And Philip had been essentially nibbling away at the Athenian Empire at this point, and was, conquering these things. And the arrogant, aristocratic, and honestly, they sound a lot like the sort of progressives of today, where they just won't hear about Philip's advance on Athens territory. And most, like Demosthenes' third Philippic, is actually fascinating in this regard, because he is sat there telling them, "Look, you have to listen. Things are happening, and in the safety of Athens, in the taverns of Athens, and the symposia of Athens, no one wants to hear it. They're like, oh no, you're a scaremonger. You're talking shit. Blah blah blah." But within a few years, Athens has been defeated and is subject to Macedon. So it turns out Demosthenes was right all along. But basically, he's warning them to listen, and they won't listen. And it's very frustrating when you're reading it back, because you know what happens. And if Demosthenes was taken more seriously, things may not have gone the way they did. But anyway, the reason Philip's military genius didn't come out of nowhere, and it was because he was lucky enough to have been in the direct sort of front rank of people who were involved with the military evolution of Greece. And yeah, it was Philip's innovation to create these giant sarissa pikes. And one thing that people forget as well is this genuinely changes the dynamic of a phalanx, because a phalanx is actually a really defensive formation. You have a giant shield, these overlocking shields, and so they're all locked in, and these men are shoulder to shoulder. Then they march forward in time, and they're very, very well protected, and they come into essentially a scrum with the enemy. And if you're not in the same kind of formation, you can effectively just push through the enemy formation just on your weight and the solid, compact nature of it. But the Macedonian phalanx of the sarissas is something completely different. So it turns from being a defensive formation into an offensive formation, where you just have like 6 ranks of giant pointy spears that are just stabbing into the enemy. And so you can essentially kind of steamroller them because they have to move out of the way for their own self-preservation. So it totally changes the dynamic of the phalanx.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is one of the innovations that I've heard was really important was that usually, and before Philip's time, a phalanx would move forward, and that's about it.
Yes.
And apparently it's really difficult for a phalanx to keep really quite a tight, very tight formation, and then sort of move laterally or move backwards as one. That's way, way, way more difficult to get men to do that. But Philip achieved that and essentially bequeathed it as well to Alexander. And there's a couple of battles where moving the phalanx back deliberately would then make a break in the enemy's line that you can then just charge some cavalry into. And just doing things like that. So it sounds like not a massive tweak, really, getting a phalanx to move backwards but keep its formation. But it was a game changer, like you say. Like for generations, that was a game winner.
And when the Romans finally discovered, when they finally came to blows with the Macedonians, I think it was Mummius who called the Macedonian phalanx the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen in his life. Because when it was coming towards them, it was just this giant wall of pikes, and I mean and the Romans beat it as well, which shows you everything you need to know about the Romans. But like you can totally believe when he's like, no, that was just terrifying to watch. Yeah, I bet it was. And if it had been the phalanx of Philip or Alexander's day, things may well have gone differently, but obviously it wasn't. So.
Yeah, not only was it a great innovation, but then also being wielded by a genius. I mean, it makes all the difference, doesn't it? But yeah, you're quite right in saying that Philip sort of influenced by the mainland Greeks, because I think the mainland Greeks, the Thebans, the Spartans, the Athenians, thought of Macedonians as a bit barbaric or not properly civilized, being northern mountain people. So I think particularly the Athenians, the sort of kind of haughty Athenians, really resented the hegemony of the Macedonians during the age of Philip. Because, I mean, even as Alexander's born, Philip is in the middle of besieging Plataea or somewhere, or Potidea or something. So Alexander's entire childhood, I think his earliest memories, all through his formative years, would have been at a court, a royal court that's at war. And largely winning most of the time, witnessing his father winning, becoming the hegemon of Greece. I mean, that would form quite important pathways in your mind for your adult pathology, I think.
Yeah, this is the same with Hannibal as well. Hannibal grew up in his father's army. And honestly, Hannibal is probably I would probably put Hannibal actually at number one. If not technically, I mean honestly, I think he probably was genuinely the best because of the situation he found himself in. But who was Hannibal's dad? I can't remember the name of Hannibal's dad. Hamilcar, that's it, right? So Hamilcar was a successful.
Yeah, I was going to say Hasdrubal, Hamilcar.
Yeah, Hamilcar. Yeah, they've got like 5 names in Carthage. But he was a mercenary not mercenary himself, but he led mercenary armies. And generally in Sicily was Hannibal's education in war, where they didn't actually lose the first war against the Romans, but yeah, so it's the same thing with Alexander. He grows up in military camps with his father, and same with Hannibal, another amazing general. So it's one of those things where it's you can see that being raised in this environment and becoming knowledgeable at it gives them real proficiency from a very young age.
Yeah. Well, Alexander is given the head of a wing of cavalry at like 16.
Yes.
And by 18 is pretty much a full general under his father. So by the time he's 20, when he gets the crown, he's able to just immediately slot himself in as a legitimate, accepted head of the army, because he's already been doing it for years and years. It's been his whole life already.
And it's the same thing happened with Hannibal as well. It was just a natural, because he'd been in the army under his father, fighting with them in wars. They naturally, he's one of them. He's on their team. He's one of them. They recognize him as legitimate, and I think that legitimacy is important and really binds the men to him. And again, the same thing happened with Hannibal, really, because both of them spent a long time a long way from home, outside of their comfort zones. And you've got to have the absolute unquestioning faith of your men to be able to do that. And unlike Alexander, Hannibal never had a revolt against his leadership either. Alexander at least had one, didn't he? So it's it's very, very interesting dynamic. But yeah, I think the fact that Alexander was born and bred with the army is important. I think it's a very important thing.
Yeah, I mean, to pick up the politics side, if you like you were saying, that it's probably Thebes that is the most powerful city-state in mainland Greece at this point. Yeah, Sparta have been defeated a generation or more ago, something like that, and they're thought of really as more mice than men at this stage. They're just like a hollow shell of something they once were.
Yeah.
But Philip and his best general, Parmenio, who becomes important, who's really Philip's right-hand man, his first general, they conquer all of Greece, or become the leaders, the hegemons of the Corinthian League, which is really all of mainland Greece and the Aegean theatre.
Yes. The interesting thing about this is the Spartans at the time and shortly after, they do try to enact reforms. I think it was Agesilaus who tried to enact reforms and bring Sparta back from the total backwater it had become. But by then it was just too late, too little too late. The Spartans refused to change, because the problems the Spartans had is that the Spartiates, the homoi, the equals, the similars, sorry, the Spartan hoplites had essentially disappeared. There was something, by the time the Battle of Leuctra came about and Thebes defeated them, there were only like 1,000 actual Spartan hoplites left, because there were ways of becoming not a Spartan hoplite if you failed to keep the amount of money you needed for the mess, and all, if you dishonored yourself, blah blah blah, you could be stripped of your status. But there was no way of gaining the status if you weren't born into it. So the number of them just dwindled, and there's the famous the famous who was I don't know, some slave in the marketplace saying to one of them, it's like, well, look around you, how many Spartans do you see, and then how many slaves do you see? And you got to remember, all these slaves would gladly eat you raw. And it's just like, it's one of those things where it's like, Christ, man, the Spartans really mishandled their population levels there.
Yeah, like the qualification to be a full Spartan citizen was just insanely high. Yeah, to the point where there weren't really any left. And they were completely unwilling to bend on anything. Like when Philip and Alexander want to make some sort of grand coalition, they say, well, we can't because we refuse to be led by any other men. So, oh, come on. Like the Spartan, the sacred band of Thebans beat you quite a while ago now. Swallow your pride a bit, but they just don't. They refuse to ever.
Yeah. And that was it for Sparta. So
yeah, and Philip was the campaign into Asia was already going to happen. It was already Philip's idea.
Philip had it planned.
Yeah, and they'd already sent people ahead to sort of the Hellespont region to sort of start scoping it out. When the events happen.
Yeah, and this is inspired by Xenophon as well, because his Anabasis, his tale of being in the Persian Empire, made them realize it was empty. It wasn't like there were going to be armies at every turn. There was the royal army and then the provincial armies led by the satraps. But other than that, they're not going to get. They knew they wouldn't get resistance from just the regular people in the empire because they're just oppressed by the Persians, basically. So what are they fighting? Why would they fight them? What difference does it make to them? And one of the interesting, you were saying how the Greeks saw the Macedonians as barbarians. Because it's important to remember that Greek thought revolved around the polis, the city state, and the Macedonians, like you say, they were like people who lived in villages in the hills and who herded goats and things like this. So they were considered to be backwards and unsophisticated and barely Greek. The Macedonians had to work very hard to be considered to be Greeks. And you can tell that it's with a great deal of sort of tongue biting that the proud and ancient city-states of like the southern mainland Greece come to accept the Macedonian leadership of the area. You can tell they really would rather not, but they don't really have much of a choice.
Yeah, like Demosthenes, I think, makes that pretty clear that they're kind of unworthy peoples. Really, they're not really barbarians, but they're not properly civilized. They're not properly Greek.
They don't live in polis,
Yeah, like even their capital, Pella, it's not much more than, it was never, I don't think, much more than a small town, really.
Yeah.
And like the size of the amphitheatre there,
Yeah, and they're constantly trying to essentially buy Greek culture. This is the thing. Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle's from Athens, and he got paid handsomely to go and teach Alexander. Apparently, Alexander was a difficult student, a very hard-headed student of his own. And Aristotle, obviously one of the great minds of Western tradition. So Alexander was very privileged. Very privileged.
Oh, extremely. I mean, if his dad is even if it's begrudgingly, his dad is still the leading man of Greece.
Yes.
Then he was extremely privileged. Aristotle was, in his own lifetime, the biggest brain around.
Absolutely.
So to just have him come and read the Iliad to your kid.
Yes.
It speaks of quite a lot of influence that Philip would have wielded.
Yeah.
But I'm glad we did actually take a step back there and talk about Alexander's childhood a bit. One of the big things is Aristotle's tutelage. But one of the main anecdotes is that of Bucephalus. Probably most people that are listening to this are probably already aware of it, but I feel we have to cover it.
Yeah.
In Arrian, which is the main source that I like, there's Curtius, Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, and a handful of others. But in Arrian, the main one, my favourite one, he says that this horse was brought to Philip and it was extremely expensive, a giant, magnificent, beautiful horse. And they wanted something like 10, 13 talents or something, which is thousands of pounds. But it was just completely unruly, completely unbroken in. No one could get near it, really. And Philip says, "Take it away. I'm not interested. It looks good, but it's no use to me." And Alexander says, "Let me try." They laugh. He's only 9, 10, 11 or something. But famously, the story goes, he realised the horse Bucephalus was just spooked by a shadow. So he wheels him round, calms him down like some sort of ancient horse whisperer, and then just leaps on his back, gallops off, and comes back, wheels him round perfectly, and brings him back completely under control. And well, it's an incredible story. Philip's almost in tears, in joy at how brilliant his own son is.
Yeah,
and the men jokingly start calling Alexander king and Philip just his general. But anyway, that's the anecdote. And he keeps Bucephalus until near the end of Alexander's life, and
where he
reveres him.
dies, doesn't he?
Yeah, he eventually dies. Well, there's a couple of different stories of Bucephalus' death, but they usually say he just died of exhaustion somewhere in the Indus Valley, and Alexander was massively heartbroken and mourned.
Founded a city in his name.
Yeah, and mourned as though he were a human friend that had passed away.
Yeah.
There's one other thing I'd say about Bucephalus. There's one bit in the middle of the story where the train, Alexander's servants, at some point in the train of the army, Bucephalus gets stolen, and Alexander finds out and just goes into an unbelievable rage and declares that if and when he finds the people who've done it, he's going to destroy their entire people.
There will be consequences for this.
and actually they hear of it and just bring him back, and Alexander's so grateful he just gives them money and things and doesn't punish them. But that's a classic Alexander way to deal with things. But we'll get into his character and
right. Well, let's begin the narrative whenever you're ready then.
Right, well, yeah, I suppose we've got to start really with Philip's assassination. Some say nobody really knows who did it. Others say it was a guy called Pausanias. But whatever happens, it was Philip got assassinated in the open. And I suppose we've got to quickly look at the politics behind that, because a lot of people have said Alexander's faction, his mum, and that whole faction may well have been behind it. And if you really just go by the sources, Curtius and Arian starts after Philip has been killed, and the first 2 books of Curtius are lost. So it's only Plutarch we've actually got on this, and he doesn't go into much detail. He's like a biographer. He's interested in the man Alexander. He's not really interested in the finer details of his father's assassination, unfortunately. But yeah, I think it's quite plausible that Alexander's mum, Olympias, may well have been behind it, because Philip had recently remarried and had another kid, and there was people grumbling that maybe Alexander wasn't as completely legitimate as he might have been, and
she was worried that he was going to get overlooked for the throne anyway. But then there's the allegations that it was Persian gold that got Philip killed, that the Persians had him assassinated because he was planning to invade, which is totally plausible. So we're stuck with these 2 quite plausible stories, and I have no idea. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, well, it's only really mentioned like in Arian halfway through when he gets a letter from Darius and he says, "Oh yeah, and another thing," and Alexander in reply says, "Oh, and another thing is, didn't you try and plot to get my dad killed? Like, that's another thing why we're pissed off with you." But I think what it was, so Alexander's mum, Olympias, was from Epirus, and she'd had Alexander, and then Philip had remarried. Philip had 7 wives. What you do, a Macedonian king would go off, conquer someone nearby, and then take the conquered king's widow or daughter as another wife and repeat. That's what you do. So you sort of have your main wife who you sire your main children with, but you have other wives. So anyway, later in his career, Philip had married some sort of Macedonian woman, princess, and got her pregnant, and they were going to have a baby. And at some drinking bout, somebody said, like, "Good luck to you, Philip, and good health to your new wife and the baby, and let's hope you have a legitimate son." And Alexander goes mental, like literally, like, "I'm going to cut this guy's throat," like that angry. And it's a real scene, and it comes to a head, and basically Alexander and his mum leave the court in Pella, and just reside back in Epirus for a while. And Alexander and his mum are really out of favour. They're out of the court entirely, but they're brought back like a little time later, a few months or a year or 2 later at most, and brought back because Alexander's really needed. He's like an adult man now, really. He's of use in the army and all that sort of thing. So Philip brings him back, and it's almost immediately at that point he's assassinated. So if they're just the facts, if they're the naked facts,
Well,
well,
was it not Pausanias who murders Philip?
yeah, it's Pausanias. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Well, some accounts say they just flatly say yes, it's him, and others say, well, it's not clear exactly who. But yeah.
right. Because as I understood it, Pausanias was a member of Philip's bodyguard, and he was killed while he was running away from the assassination itself.
Hmm.
So, like again, we've got no evidence either way, and there's no way we could ever find any. But I mean, that's a hell of a bold thing to do. So I would be surprised. I mean, just if I was speculating, I mean, would you do that for money? Would you just kill him out in the open for money? It strikes me as being kind of crazy.
Well, it's one of those things where you think you need to take into account people's hatred. So, for example, when you look at Lincoln,
Hmm.
just for example, President Lincoln, you think, he's a great figure, or an important figure. What kind of weak, despicable son of a bitch does it take to shoot him in the back of the head when he's not looking?
Yeah.
But if you look from the assassin's point of view, Lincoln was a terrible butcher who had destroyed your land and your way of living and everything. He was an evil demon
Hmm.
who who deserved to be shot in the back of the head. So it might be the same with Philip. If you were a very, very proud Athenian or Theban, Philip was just simply a tyrant who had robbed you of your freedom, and so you don't need any more motivation than that. But I don't know. If I really had to put money on it, I would think Alexander's mum may well have been behind it. It seems from the accounts, if you just take the accounts on their own, Alexander seems to have been shocked and disgusted and really wanted to hunt down the killers wherever
Hmm.
possible, and carried around some sort of guilt, even though he wasn't really behind it his whole life and that sort of thing. But it's hard to say. We've got a few lines here and there. So your
So
guess is
I'm
as good as
just
mine.
yeah, I'm just looking at the Wikipedia account, and it claims that a memorial to Pausanias was erected by Olympias after he'd left Macedon. I don't know how true that is. Like, I can't. I mean, I've no idea. But like, I mean, that doesn't make Olympias look more innocent, does it? You know? Like putting a memorial up to the assassin is a bit of a weird thing to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, if that is true, that does speak volumes, doesn't it? But there's that old
Yeah,
thing: look who gains. Look who gains from an assassination or
yeah,
from a
yeah.
killing, and it's simply Alexander and his mum and that whole faction.
Yeah,
Um,
but again, if we're arguing that this is a Persian conspiracy theory, that they the Persians were afraid of Philip invading because he was obviously going to, and they thought, right, we'll pay an assassin. With the assassin, like you say, might have legitimate grievances. I mean, the Wikipedia account here suggests that uh, it's been supposed that Pausanias' motives for killing Philip was at least in part due to personal anger over Philip, who hosted a party where Pausanias was raped and didn't intervene, or even reprimanded Attalus, who's the man who raped him. So if that's true, then I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be Persian gold that did it, but if the Persians are looking for someone who will kill Philip, then maybe they paid this guy. Who knows? And maybe Olympias was just like an angry Twitter woman who's just like, good. It's a good thing that happened. I'm going to put up a celebration to him, a memorial to him. So who knows? But either way, Philip's killed.
yeah, I've not heard that story actually about Pausanias being raped. I've never heard that before. I don't know if that's in Diodorus. That's the one I'm least familiar with. But I've reread Arian and
It,
Curtis
it
and
is in
Plutarch
Diodorus. That's
recently.
correct.
Ah, right. Okay, I
Yeah.
see. All right, fair enough. Um, but yeah, so Philip's, is murdered, and Alexander pretty much just immediately just plops straight in. The head of the army is sort of Parmenio probably, and he accepts or is in line with Alexander's accession. So
Yeah.
that just seems to happen. But as as in the ancient world or even the medieval world, any time really in the pre-modern era, when monarchies like this, when something unexpected happens and a new claimant comes in, everyone rebels because because the power was based upon the sort of personal, individual charisma and power of the last monarch. And no one knows yet whether his 20-year-old son's going to be any good or not. So when Philip dies, most of Greece and all the hill peoples around Macedonia and in Thrace rebel. And
Yeah.
Alexander has to just start putting them down straight away.
Yeah, so very quickly, yeah. These people had generally been pacified by Philip.
Mm.
So it's not like they'd been under the Macedonian thumb for very long. And
No.
obviously, with the death of Philip, they're thinking, well, this is the perfect opportunity to get our freedom again. And so, yeah, Alice saying Alexander has to go into Thrace and north, just above Macedonia, and start putting all these hill tribes down, which is an interesting story in itself, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and he thinks that. Well, there's a few interesting anecdotes about exactly how he does it, with arranging wagons and rolling stones down on people and all these sorts of things. But he thinks that after he puts down a few hill people, that he's going to be good to go, to the Hellespont and go across to Asia, and it's going to be all hunky dory to start off that huge campaign. But then he gets news that Thebes has rebelled.
Yes.
And that's a serious problem. He can't leave the sort of Greek theatre with that behind him. He has to quell really, if he's going to be gone for years, he has to quell anything that's going to cause a problem back home. And so Thebes, being probably the preeminent polis in Greece, he decides he's going to have to make an example of them.
Yeah, and the like we said, Thebes was where Philip was raised into being a man. So this is important. But the thing is, Thebes is also an ancient city, and this is the thing. The Greek warfare was not generally about destruction of cities. In fact, that's very, very rare. In fact, I mean, when the Thebans defeated the Spartans, they didn't march on Sparta. All they did is go around freeing all the helots and all the subject cities that were subject to the Spartans. They didn't march on Sparta. So Alexander comes down, defeats the Athenians and Theban coalition, destroys the sacred band, and then levels the city. That was just shockwaves across the Greek world. This is a staggering thing to have had happen.
Yeah, massively. Like the speed, apart from the thing itself, the speed and ease with which it was done. Just in and of itself, it's kind of unprecedented and kind of mad. No one could really believe it. But that it was done at a stroke.
Yes.
Really just, reverberates through the millennia to this day that we're talking about it right now, that it was just incredible. And a lot of scores were settled, like the Boeotians and various other peoples that the Thebans had been bastards to for generations upon generations, sort of get their chance to, slaughter all the men and sell all the women and children into slavery and more or less destroy all the buildings. It sounds like almost a complete sacking. Really hardly anything or anyone left. So to go from really the premier city in Greece to nothing.
To be wiped out under Alexander. But this is something that Plutarch tells us that Alexander is very, very distraught over. He wishes he didn't do it, which is all well and good in retrospect, but it's a bit late now, isn't it, Alex?
Well, apparently he was, quote, ubiquitous in the field during the siege, and sort of allowed some massacres to go on because that was the point. It was to show all of Greece, don't rebel, don't you dare rebel, because this is what happened to you. But then when the dust cleared, so to speak, he realized how absolute the killing and destruction had been. Even for him it was like, oh, okay, that was a bit much, that was a bit gross. And that actually plays out more than once in his career.
Yes, it does.
But for the first time it happened straight away at Thebes.
Well, this is the thing, because a lot of the time people want to portray Alexander as some almost like a gentleman, like a very noble man. And the thing is, I don't know if he was. I mean, he's prone to bouts of absolute rage. And I mean, like, destroying a city isn't actually something you could just do overnight. Like, there's a lot of effort in destroying an ancient city by hand, and so a lot of time it takes like a week or something to do it. And so when we're looking at the historical record, it seems to all be compressed into like, all right, okay, and Thebes is destroyed, and then that's like a week-long process of burning the city, capturing everyone, killing all the men by hand, selling all of the women and children into slavery and reaping the money from that. That takes time. And so Alexander must have allowed that to go on before thinking, well, shit, man, did I want that?
Yeah, well, I mean, what we're talking about really really is an extended scene of horror.
Yes.
There's been no mistake. It's easy enough there. And then he sacked Thebes and killed all the men, sold the women, left no brick on top of another. But wait a minute, that is really like a sickening thing that you're talking about, you know. And it's really easy because it's so far away in time to sort of forget these things. But yeah, it must have been a terrible thing. But it worked though.
Well, yeah,
you know,
I mean, it dealt with the
rest of
Theban
Greece
question.
was out. And the Athenians were getting uppity, and then when that happened, they were like, "Oh, okay, actually, no, yeah, you can be the hegemon, or you can be the leader of the Corinthian League, and actually have a few more honours than Philip ever had as well. Thanks,
Please
please
don't do
don't
this
do
to
the
us."
same."
Yeah.
There's one quick quote from Plutarch where it says that this is Alexander speaking. Demosthenes, said he, called me a boy while I was in Illyrium and among the Tribani, and a sapling when in Thessaly. But I will show him before the walls of Athens that I am a man. End quote.
Christ.
In
You
other
had
words, I
this
mean,
coming,
I think.
Demosthenes.
Sorry, go on.
So no, just Demosthenes was like, oh god, I wish I kept my mouth shut now.
Yeah, I mean, I think Alexander does ride down to Athens,
Yeah.
and at his approach, as I say, they're just like, oh, sorry. And I think he wants the arrest of Demosthenes and others, but they sort of worm their way out of it. But as I say, ultimately, it really works because he goes off, he never comes back. He's off for sort of 12 years, and none of the Greek cities do attempt to rebel or invade Macedonia while he's gone or anything. So, and he leaves one of the main generals, Antipater, or sometimes people call him Antipater, but he leaves Antipater and his mum Olympias as regents in Macedonia to rule over the Greek world while he's gone, and they're able to do it. So that sacking of Thebes did do its job.
I thought Antipater did have to put down some Spartan rebellion.
Oh, actually, yeah. To be fair, might have been one or two, especially in the early days. I think there was a little rebellion. But what I mean ultimately is that the Macedonian crown was never usurped in his absence or anything like that. But I think you're right. Actually, there were one or two small rebellions.
Yeah, no, there was. I'm just looking up now. Yeah, the Spartans, who are not members of the League of Corinth, and not participated, and the Persians funded Sparta's ambitions, so they managed to raise a 20,000 man strong army, but it was no match for the Macedonians, and just got smashed. So it was near Megalopolis. See, there was an attempt by Sparta, funded by the Persians, and it's interesting how much the Persians funded the Spartans over like the century after the Persian invasion of Greece as well. Considering the Spartans have been like one of the most strong opponents of the Persians gave the Spartans a lot of money to defeat Athens in the Peloponnesian War, and then to go against the Macedonians now. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Spartans, those defenders of the Greeks, seem to have sold out pretty quickly for people who are not interested in money. Right. But yeah, the Athenians didn't give them any trouble after Chaeronea.
Yeah, well, I mean, Chaeronea is, I think, still under Philip's, but that was when they were really.
But no, it was after Chaeronea that was no further trouble from the Athenians at all, was there?
Yeah. They talked themselves up a bit, but they never actually attempted anything in the field, so to speak. And so after that, Alex's sort of the next episode is Alexander and his army, Parmenio and all his generals. Well, some of the main henchmen you probably start to need to know about.
Before we cross over into Persia, one of the things I found, I can't remember which Thracian tribe it was, but they'd actually managed to get the better of Alexander and like pinned him in a valley, and it was looking bad. The enemy troops were all ranged around on the hillsides, and so the Macedonians are absolutely screwed. And Alexander manages to get them out of it by essentially intimidating the Thracians, by drilling his army in the plain that they're in, and I don't know, somehow tricking them or something like that, so they can actually escape out of one exit from this defile that they found themselves in. Although I can't remember exactly which battle that was now, and which tribe it was. But it was interesting how even then he was showing remarkable cunning in the field and a very, very significant amount of military strategy, because I mean all of the army, all the generals that he's with, it's just like, Christ, we've really got ourselves in a bad way here. And Alexander uses his brain to get them out rather than brawn, which I think is an impressive thing.
Is that the one where it's something about he gets the men to? It's not called a tortoise, but it sounds like they're describing sort of a Roman tortoise type formation where they put their shields over their heads, and allow all the debris that's being thrown down on them just to harmlessly roll by, and they can just take. Is that the one where they can just take the higher ground that way? Something like
Yeah,
that.
I'm just skimming through the. I think it's the Tribalians.
Well, it
The
does actually go north of the Danube. There's a whole bit where it talks about he
yeah,
goes north of the Danube and puts peoples down there. There's a great
yeah,
line actually. I can't remember who's it in. It must be Plutarch, I suppose. But anyway, he says Alexander just basically fancied going north of the Danube and fucking up a few people north of the Danube. He just fancied doing that today, and so they did for a bit. Basically, as simple as that. It's great.
yeah. So yeah, I can't remember exactly which one it was now, but yeah, there is where he goes up and fights the Sarmatians and the Getae and all these sort of people. Basically makes them understand that, look, we're in charge and you better know it.
Yeah, just because Philip's dead, like, don't
Yeah,
think you can get away with just doing what you want. The Macedonian crown is still in control. God damn it!
yeah,
and
yeah,
uh, and and again, whatever he did seemed to have worked.
yeah.
Pretty well.
I mean, he's like 3,000 miles to the east and nobody challenges them. So
Mm. Yeah. So when they do come to sort of cross the Hellespont, it's very auspicious. I think it's one of them bits in the story where um, the writers, the Roman writers that we've got, know how it ends, and
yeah,
so they almost can't help themselves than to add in details which are just perfectly auspicious. Things like, for example, throwing a spear down and claiming the land, like
yeah, and
you
that's
know
a
we
Roman tradition as well. That's how the Romans declared war on people, is throwing a spear into the enemy territory. So it's interesting how they projected their own custom onto the Macedonians, and I doubt the Macedonians did that.
and things like his seers had read in the birds that now that he's crossed into Asia and stepped foot on it unopposed, he's destined to become the king of kings. And just the normal, actual, real reality of the world and the way history works is that they wouldn't have known that at that point. They couldn't
No,
have,
no, yeah,
because
yeah,
it just smacks of someone that knows how the story ends. And so you say, he did all these things, and again, it's just too perfectly auspicious. But he's supposed to have crossed the Hellespont and given thanks and built altars to his favorite gods,
yeah,
Apollo, Dionysus, Hercules, these sorts of people. And one of the nice stories is visiting Troy, because we've said it before in a couple of the other videos, and I'm sure we'll say it again in this one, but he loved Achilles and wanted to emulate Achilles and the story of the Iliad. So of course he must visit Troy.
Well, did he not sleep with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow or something like that, wasn't it?
Yeah. That's one of the things
It's
in
one of the
Curtius. It
stories.
said,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Or he had a copy. It says, I think, in Plutarch that he considers the Iliad to be like an actual handbook in military exercises, something like that. It's an actual handbook in how to conduct yourself in war. And I
I've
don't know
read
if
the
you're
Iliad, and
familiar with the Iliad. Yeah,
I don't
it's not
consider
really
it to
like
be
that,
that.
is it?
No, no. I
No,
mean,
not at
it's
all.
and the thing is, like, even if okay, let's assume we're using the Iliad as a model of Greek military tactics. They spent 10 years sieging Troy. That's terrible. Like, Alexander
Yeah.
didn't spend 10 years sieging anyway. Like, what? Lesson learned: don't do what they did in the Iliad. Don't do what Achilles did. He got killed and didn't win. Like yeah, no, I mean, it's the romance of it that he must have been in love with. Come on.
Yeah. This is the actual line from Plutarch. I just found it actually. It said, quote, he loved polite. This is talking about Alexander. Quote,
Yeah,
he loved polite learning too, and his natural thirst of knowledge made him a man of extensive reading. The Iliad, he thought, as well as called, a portable treasure of military knowledge, and he had a copy corrected by Aristotle, which he called the casket copy. Later, he had this special casket built for his personal copy that Aristotle had given him. But yeah, he was, it seems, obsessed with the Iliad and the story of
yeah.
Achilles and Patroclus, and more than that, of course, the whole Homeric mold of what it means to be a hero.
Yes, yeah, and that's what I mean by the romance of it. It's not the tactics or anything like that, because there are no real tactics laid out in the Iliad. That's the thing. Um, it's about how the person conducts themselves.
Yeah, it's just like a series of little stories. It's not.
It's like a
It's nothing
drama.
to.
It's like a soap
Yeah,
opera.
yeah. It's like a story. It's not a way to conduct yourself or conduct wars at all. But um,
Yeah, I mean,
Nonetheless, that's what
Achilles has
Plutarch
had it.
says.
Who was the leader of it? Was it Menelaus?
Well, Agamemnon is the leader of the
Agamemnon.
group,
That's it. That's
but
it. Yeah.
but that's sort of the point. They're kings that are supposed to be equals, even though Agamemnon's sort of the over king. But
Yeah.
Achilles
Yeah.
doesn't really respect his authority at all, does he?
Yeah.
For a
But they
start.
a lot, but this the thing is, a lot of it is basically like a soap opera where they're bitching and moaning and arguing with one another. And so Achilles is like, no, I'm just going to stay in my tent with my myrmidons, and we're not leaving. The hell with you. And it's like, oh God, come on, boys, kiss and make up, because he didn't give us the share of the treasure that we wanted or something. It's like, God, you sound like children.
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of it is a bit silly, just like Diomedes having a battle with a god and
Mm,
winning and things like this, and it
Athena
just
wasn't it?
doesn't. Yeah, yeah, it doesn't really make complete sense. And having loads of single combats in the middle of a battle, and it's really just it's really part of the oral tradition meant for a good
Yeah,
story. It's not
yeah,
really how you should conduct yourself in the reality of ancient war. But
yeah.
I mean, that's what the account said. Whether it's true or not is and it's just for us to talk
Well,
about and argue about.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I've got no doubt that he loved the Iliad. That's probably true. And when
Yeah.
they say, he went up to Ilium and offered sacrifice to Trojan Athena and set up his own temple and as an offering and stuff like this, I'm sure he did all that. That's typical sort of Greek religiosity, and that's totally believable.
Yeah, running naked around the tomb of Achilles
Yeah,
with your friends. Apparently, that was the thing to do. If you if you visited ancient Troy, that was what you're supposed to do. And the other thing to probably mention is at Troy is that he, in one of the temples, on the main temple, he left some of his armor and arms and took some of theirs.
yeah.
And
I
so
I
one of the
find
things he
that
took
hard
was
to
this
believe.
ancient shield, some sort of ancient shield of Achilles. Yeah, it seems a bit too good, a bit too perfect, but
Well, I
yeah,
mean,
that's
like
supposed
the
to happen.
if he let's assume that he finds in some Trojan temple some Trojan armor, which is highly unlikely. It's not going to be in good condition. So we're talking about something that happened almost 1,000 years before
Yeah, a
Achilles.
thousand years ago. Yeah,
Yeah. So there's no way I believe that. I'm sorry.
yeah. No, no, that's reasonable. No, I agree. It doesn't seem likely, but you never know. And if it did, it would have been in probably pretty terrible shape. Yeah, because it was
Yeah. Yeah.
it would have had to have been bronze, I suppose. I don't know, but yeah,
Well, it would have been
um,
bronze, but the any leather straps on it that would have held it together would have been decayed away, rotten away. So you wouldn't have been able to wear it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, so he crosses the Hellespont with about, they say, probably the numbers again are up for dispute, and the different accounts have slightly different numbers, but maybe 30,000 men and 5,000 horse, which isn't, it's quite big, it's decent, but it's not fantastically big, you know.
Yeah. So on the subject of numbers, I'm sure we discussed this previously, but I've always
Yeah,
been cynical of the attempts to minimize numbers. I've always because not because I want to inflate their numbers either. It just they do have to feed these people. So and I
mm,
hate the ancient people couldn't count. Yes, they could count. They knew if you're gonna take an army of like any size into the field for any amount of time, you have to know how many men you've got and how you're feeding them. So the quartermaster would definitely have known how many people were in that army. I just find it condescending from a modern perspective to say that they were either desperately trying to lie about the numbers, or they weren't able to count the number they had in their own army and things like this. I find that really patronizing, and I really don't like it. Um, but anyway, so yeah, I think 30,000 infantry and 5,000 horse is probably a very fair assessment given the resources. I mean, they were the masters of Greece. They got tribute from Greek states, and when you're winning battles, you draw men to you. People want to fight for you when you're on the winning side. So I think it's very plausible. I mean, to be honest with you, that's a
mm,
very small. I would have said that was a very small number to invade Persia with, because like from the Greek perspective, where like like Athens could put like 10,000 hoplites in the field, and then like probably 30,000 light infantry and a few hundred cavalry. Um, Athens was a big Greek state, but it, in the way that the world had worked up until then, it was a very small place. Um, I mean, like the Assyrians, like 200 or 300 years before, were definitely putting over 100,000 men into the field. You know, and so it's like large tribes could easily have put more men into the field than that. So to say 30,000 is a very, very, very modest amount on the scale of world armies at the time.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say it's not really enough. I wouldn't
Mm,
have,
mm,
I wouldn't have been all that happy with it. But the numbers in all these ancient things, as you quite rightly say, are debated. And I think in the campaigns of Alexander, they've been even more heavily scrutinized and debated than many other periods in history. So where I said 30,000 men, 5,000 horse, that's sort of well, I think Curtius exaggerates it. Well, not exaggerates it. He puts a bit higher number than Arian, and so historians go, okay, well, it's probably somewhere between those two. And then,
yeah,
yeah, you get some historians who say it's massively inflated, and some that say no, they're not idiots. They can count. They weren't idiots. So why wouldn't we
yeah,
take them at
yeah.
their? And anyway, it's been poured over by a great deal, but I think it's totally reasonable to think that 30,000 men, 5,000 horse, as he at the point when he crosses the Hellespont, is perfectly reasonable and makes sense to me. And you're right; it's almost not enough.
Yeah, yeah.
It's enough to sweep down, that Ionian coastline there. But
Oh yeah.
you would want more once you reach a royal army. But as we'll find out as we go through the story, that number swells. Like even 10 years later, it's twice as big
Mm,
because of all different reasons, and they won't be the
yeah.
same people. But yeah,
But
at
the
this early stage, it's worryingly few, if
it's
anything.
very modest. And like I say, especially considering what they must have known the Persians can put into the field. Because I mean, like when the
Mm.
Persians invaded Greece, the Greeks thought there were 4 million Persians, and the modern estimates are about 200, 300,000. Okay, let's assume it's the modern estimate is accurate here. That's still like 5 times bigger than what Philip is even entering the Persian Empire with. So the Greeks at the time were well aware the Persians could field untold, infinite numbers of men effectively. And so what the Greeks are banking on, and this is very clear, it's the quality of the troops, because one of the things they learned from Xenophon and the Greeks in the Persian invasion of Greece is that the Greek infantry was just better than the Persian infantry by a
Yeah,
long way. The Persian infantry, in fact, often would not even stand to fight them because
yeah,
they were quite terrifying. So there's a huge amount of confidence in their own fighting ability, which is something I actually find really admirable. It's very interesting how they're so bold. But the Greeks are a very warlike culture, and this is what I think a lot because Greek philosophy has taken hold in the West for such a long time. People forget just how warlike the Greeks were. They were very happy to fight. They had very heavy armor. They had a very secure position on the battlefield in a phalanx, and so the number of men who would die in a successful engagement would be in handfuls. I mean, the Battle of Marathon was something like 192 Greeks died out of like 12,000 they had, and 40,000 Persians. So it's a very very small number. So you're very likely to live through an ancient battle if you're on the winning side. And even then, like in the Battle of Marathon, there were 30,000 Persians and only 6,400 of them died. So you're actually more likely to survive the battle no matter what side you're on.
mm. Yeah, and of course, this army that Alexander and Parmenio and the other generals are leading into Asia are sort of the best of the best. I mean, I
Mm.
hesitate to say call them special forces or something, but
So why don't you use the regular army? What do you need us for?
Because some damn fool accused you of being the best.
they're a really advanced, sophisticated form of phalanx. They're not just a great phalanx. They've already taken on the best that Greece can offer, which
Oh
is
yeah.
superior in quality to anything they're likely to meet in Asia, and bested that with ease. Again, just to hark back to Thebes, the way they swept through there barely as though it was nothing.
Yeah.
So yeah, what he's leading this army into, they're already veterans. They're already sort of
Yes.
special forces veterans, if you like, and so yeah, it's like the Asia hasn't seen the like of it.
Yeah. Veterans is a very good way of putting them because these are very experienced troops. Very experienced. So this is what I mean about Alexander being given all the natural gifts. He's the natural leader of the army, so no one challenges him for that. He's been raised in a state of war for his whole life, and he's been given like if this was Rome Total War, these are all gold ranked units. These are the best units that your kingdom has, and you're invading Persia that has loads of levies that are fresh in many ways, and it's just like it starts sounding like a foregone conclusion when you put it this way, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's easy to fall into that. You shouldn't. But you're right. It's easy to fall into that when you know how things end. That it's inevitable that he was going to be this sort of golden figure in history. But of course, nothing's inevitable. One of the battles could have not gone his way, and the whole history of man turns on a dime. But you're right that he had some of the people around him, the names that will come up. I've mentioned Parmenio, sort of this old dog, this old hag, wily old goat, who's sort of the main general. And his son, his grown-up son, Philotas, who is also sort of Alexander's friend. Sort of grew up together as aristocrats at the Macedonian court. But there's others, famously his best friend Hephaestion. There's other names that come up that we'll have to mention: Perdiccas, Seleucus, Clytus, Nearchus, the naval commander, and Ptolemy. Obviously, will come up.
And these are all very accomplished commanders in their own right. Like Seleucus and Ptolemy, after Alexander's death, to spoil it, this event that happened thousands of years ago, Seleucus becomes one of the greatest generals in history himself, and rules over an empire almost as large as Alexander's for 200 years or something. His dynasty rules over this giant empire, and he wins loads of battles on his own after the death of Alexander. So these are, it's a very, very competent and very experienced cadre of leaders that Philip has amassed. They've been in the dirt, they've done the work, and they've got the best army in the world, some of the best generals in the world, in all of history, in fact. And you've got this 20-year-old guy who's unbelievably well suited for the job, who's leading them. So again, it seems like the Macedonians are totally the underdogs, but I'm not even sure if they are.
Yeah,
I'm not sure they are the underdogs.
Goal.
All of the right requirements are in place. But I mean, you've got to capitalize on these things, and I'm not trying to take anything away from Alexander, obviously. But yeah, no, it was definitely a perfect storm, is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, because I think, again, what we hinted at just a minute ago, that it seems like, why wouldn't Alexander march into the empty Persian Empire and smash them up in 5 years flat? It was going to be a cakewalk. Well, actually, that's not really how it was. He had to even borrow money. Apparently, he says right in one of his speeches right at the end, when his men are kind of rebelling, and he reminds them of all the risks he had to take. He says, I had to borrow money even to get across the Hellespont and take all these risks and actually put myself in physical danger multiple times, and nothing was for granted. And remember how much is actually you owe me in a way. But so.
No, that's a good point. I mean, again, it's easy to sit back when we're in our rooms talking about this, and there's no danger, and we're not going through any hardship. We haven't, it's easy to sort of quarterback, our armchair general it. But yeah,
you're right. Like figures like Ptolemy, for example, who was just, but he was a cavalry commander. But goes on to found a dynasty that doesn't end until the age of Augustus, 300 years later. Cleopatra is a Macedonian name. Alexander's got a sister, or is it his half sister, who's a Cleopatra? Yeah. And these were incredible men in their own right. And one of the things that's yet another thing that points to how sort of great or incredible Alexander was, that these men were, war bastards. Really, and he kept them all in line. As soon as he dies, there's just a civil war, and it's unbelievably cutthroat, and they all prove themselves to be extremely capable men. But while he's alive, he keeps them all in line, and they do as they're told. I mean, that is in and of itself is something of note.
It's very interesting how they're all they all accept their place while Alexander lives, and the succession is not in doubt. They don't question it. This is understood. It's a common acceptance. But yeah, anyway. So yeah, let's carry on.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, one of the first events really then that comes up is the first of the three big battles. Are we
not cutting the Gordian knot?
Oh, that's a while, yeah, I think.
Oh,
isn't it? The Granicus is the Granicus is pretty soon after
Sorry,
he crosses into.
Yeah.
I'm not going to miss Gordian, Carl.
Sorry. I didn't know how far. I thought we were getting the three big battles with Darius.
Yeah, well. So there's three
But
big battles Alexander has, but the first one, Darius isn't actually personally there.
no.
At the Battle of
But
Granicus.
this is it. All right, so okay, let me get the. It's been a long time since I've
So it's Granicus. Issus is the second one,
yeah,
and Gaugamela is the third
Gamma.
one. But yeah, so the first one's at the River Granicus.
Right, and oh yeah, this is in Phrygia. Yeah. This is so literally he's not far out of Greece at this point. He's just across the Hellespont.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and this is the Persian satrap. This is exactly what you'd expect. It's the Persian satrap goes to engage, but it's quite an insufficient force if you look at it, according to the Wikipedia numbers. There was no way this guy was going to beat him.
Yeah, it feels like a bit of a half measure from the Persians. Apparently, Darius hears that Alexander has crossed over into Asia, and that he should send men against him. And so Darius does. He decides not to, levy the entire royal army right now. Hopefully, maybe his satraps out west can deal with him. I think there's a Memnon of Rhodes and a few other people.
Yeah, he was the naval commander, wasn't he?
Memnon of Rhodes.
Yeah, I thought he was a naval commander.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could take on more than one hat, but there was a Pharnabazus, I think, was another one of the guys. There's a few few different satraps, a couple of different ones at Granicus. But one of the things that happens is there's this river, the Granicus, and the Macedonians, the Greeks, are on one side, and this Persian army that have turned up to try and stop them are on the other side, and a little bit of an impasse. And Alexander says, right, well, we're just gonna wade
across.
We're just gonna wade in daylight, just wade in across the river under any bombardment they want to do, and try and fight our way up the far bank. And that's what we're gonna do.
It's ridiculous, isn't it? What a ridiculous plan that is. Like you think that's a plan to get us all killed, Alexander. Thanks very much.
Well, Parmenio, the sort of the oldest hand there, says, steady on. I mean, let's not maybe do that. That is a bit silly. And Alexander just says, "Fuck you, I'm in charge."
Yeah.
What
do you know, man? Shut up, boomer.
Yeah, whatever, boomer.
Yeah.
And Alexander goes in first, I think, and they just wade across, and it's just a hard fought slog. Just a slog.
Because it's up a slope as well, isn't it? So if I recall
on
correctly,
the other side, the slippy, muddy slope. Yeah,
it's a bloody ridiculous tactic. Actually, it's not even a tactic. It's just go forward and beat them because we're better than them. And it's like, and the thing is, I was always surprised about this one just because it seems so unsophisticated for Alexander. Normally he's already demonstrated he's a sophisticated commander, and so this we're just going to go up this muddy bank, across this river, up this muddy bank, and then kill them. Like, that's very blunt.
Yeah, and he does this sort of thing, or a similar sort of thing, many times. But for me, this one seems particularly ridiculous. Like, particularly like he's just got it in his head that that's what he wants to do, and nothing, including his own death, is going to stop him from doing it. It seems that they just, through sheer force of will, battle their way up the far side, and it just becomes like a maelstrom of cavalry on cavalry. And Alexander gets smashed in the head, actually part of his helmet cut away, and he stabs one of the other leading captains or generals personally in some sort of one-on-one combat, and it's all very glorious sort of Bronze Age stuff.
Well, like it's definitely out of the Iliad, isn't it? But it's so unbelievably dangerous. Like I'm just looking now, a Persian noble named Spithridates was killed by Cletus the Black as he almost killed Alexander while he was stunned after the axe blow on the head. So it's like, it's all very, like thick of the fighting. And this was because Alexander just charged his companion cavalry just directly into the Persian line. And so, like, Alexander's fighting with the Persian nobles on horseback, who are the best troops they've got. The hypothesis about this is that the Macedonians were using lances rather than javelins for melee fighting, and that's the theory as to why the Persians lost. But I mean, like, when it's in the thick of the fighting like that, I'm sure it's just a desperate scramble, isn't it?
Oh yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's pretty much what Arian says. He says it become like an infantry battle on horseback. So it's just every man for himself in a maelstrom, and there's no real sort of tactical use of manoeuvring or anything like that. It's just every man for himself in one big bloody mess, chaotic mess.
Yeah, and it just so happens the Macedonians are tougher, and they rout them.
Yeah, and Alexander is right in the middle of it, even gets wounded, one of many wounds. I think he has over 20 wounds by the time he dies. They say there's over 20 wounds on his body. Some are quite serious. And he gets wounded here. But again, it's just personally in the thick of it. That's a great little story, actually, there, when someone saves him. Someone's just about to kill Alexander and someone chops his hand off in mid-swing.
Yeah, Clitus the Black.
It is almost like a bit too perfect. It is like cinematic almost to cut his hand off mid-swing. But
well, I don't know if he did cut his hand off mid-swing. Is that what it says?
Well, again, these things, Arrian will differ slightly from Plutarch, will differ slightly from Curtius, but I'm pretty sure, I think it might be in Curtius, and I may be getting this wrong with something in the Battle of Issus, but there's one point where one of Alexander's captains cut someone's hand off mid-swing when they're about to strike the king down, and it's all a bit too perfect again, I think.
Yeah. I'm just reading Plutarch's account, and he says, while Spithridates was raising his arm for another stroke, Cletus, the black Cletus, got started and ran him through the body with his spear. And the guy who stunned him was killed by Alexander. But but anyway, you get the feel for the fight that's going on. It's rough stuff.
Actually, this might be a good point to just a quick aside to talk about that, to talk about the historiography of Alexander, the way different accounts are slightly different. Exactly what we just spoke about there, where you say, well, I thought this detail was a bit different. What I wanted to say was that where we've talked about Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, and then Xenophon and his Anabasis. That's really quite a straightforward thing. It's a person talking about what they lived through, and so it's more or less as straightforward as historiography can get. The Alexander legend is more complicated than that. It's a bit more like a Christ figure where there's no immediate accounts from his life. Everything's second-hand. The oldest gospel is at least 80 years after the death of Christ.
When you say second-hand, not even second-hand, is it? It's like third or fourth hand,
Right, so there's people that actually were on campaign with Alexander, like Ptolemy. There's some other people like Callisthenes, and there's a guy called Aristobulus. All their accounts are lost to us. Apparently they still existed even into late antiquity, maybe into the 3rd, 4th century AD, but they're all lost to us now. But these Roman writers like Arrian, Curtius, Plutarch, that we'd have had access to them as well as many others. Arrian mentions that there are dozens and dozens of histories that are all lost to us now that he had access to. And even like the accounts of Alexander's personal secretary, Eumenes, apparently he kept a diary, and Arrian would have had access to that. And anyway, the accounts that we've got left, again, Plutarch, Curtius, Arrian, Diodorus, that's all we've got. And so we have to kind of read between the lines. And they're hundreds of years later, it's like 400 years later. Arrian, our best account is Arrian, and it's 400 years later. So, it's a few places removed. And so Alexander really occupies a place somewhere between history and legend. If Vader's more machine than man, Alexander is sort of more legend than history in a way. Or you can argue about that. Historians argue about that exact thing.
Yeah. But it is important to note that and again, what's weird about this is that it's a lot like Muhammad, actually. Like, a lot of this is theoretically done in the full light of history, but because it's thousands of years ago, it's still lost, and it's kind of frustrating.
It's sort of, it is and it isn't. It's like I say, that blurring of the line between legend and real history. So, for example, there'll be a line in Curtius where he says, Ptolemy said exactly this, and then he'll quote, like put it in quotes. So we say, Aristobulus, who was there, says this, and then quotes them, or he'll say, many different accounts differ, but I think it's this one. And so when they say stuff like that, you can be, historians are kind of relatively confident that particular nugget of information's fairly solid ground, And then there'll be other things where the two accounts we've got completely differ. Like they'll say a completely different guy. And so we don't know at that point. We're sort of lost. You just have to guessing at that point. But, it's interesting. It is more, there is a fair bit of guesswork, and it puts a romantic tint on things when you're not sure. It
does. But I mean, I would find it like, take for example the Battle of the Granicus here, right? I would find it hard to believe that there aren't heroic stories that involve Alexander and his men, like his most close companions personally. I'd be very surprised if after this kind of series of conquests, they didn't have a bunch of these very impressive sounding stories to tell. It would be almost impossible to believe that things like that didn't happen. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take it as read. It doesn't involve a mythical account. That's the thing. It's like, this guy hit Alexander in the head with an axe and it stunned him, and then there's another guy who was coming in to kill him. Clitus killed that guy, and then Alex recovered and then killed the guy who hit him. That's totally believable. That could have happened quite easily. So I'm not happy. I don't feel the need to be a massive skeptic about all those things.
Yeah, no, it's fun. And again, like Arrian and Quintus Curtius Rufus say quite a lot. There's this account out there, or there's this story about Alexander, but I think it's nonsense because of this, this, and this. They're much more sophisticated as historians than Xenophon, Herodotus, Thucydides. They're in some ways they're quite modern. They'll say there's this account and this account. I think it must be this account because X, Y, Z, and so that's quite nice to read as a modern reader, because you feel some sort of that they have got a sense of the historiography of it, and that they're trying to find out what the truth was. Like sometimes they'll say there's this account about Alexander, but it must be nonsense because of whatever. And so yeah, it's like the story of Alexander as has come down to us through the Roman accounts, our oldest accounts. Yeah, you can't rely on it completely, and some of it may well be exaggerated, etc. But nearly everything they say is pretty reliable. The archaeology backs up. When they say Alexander stopped here in the middle of Afghanistan somewhere and founded something, and the archaeology confirms it's true, that sort of thing has happened many, 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 many times. So although the story is a big chunk of legend to it, it's still fairly safe ground, really.
Yeah. The facts of the events are generally borne out by archaeology. It's the texture that we can't be sure about. The sort of did he cut through the Gordian knot or not? Who knows? That kind of the texture of it. But I mean, they do make for great stories, so fuck it. Let's let it ride. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me either way. It just sounds great. Let's do it.
Yeah. And so after they win at the Battle of the Granicus, I mean, one of the things Alexander does is any Persian mercenaries any Greek mercenaries on the Persian side, he massacres and puts to death, because that's a real no-no. But as you say, on the winning side, you often can get away with very, very few casualties. And this is one of those examples. There are a few dozen of his cavalry companions are cut down, but he sends he commissions statues in their honor, in each one of their honor, so there can't be that many,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I mean, just looking at the Wikipedia stats, so some scholars have gone through an estimate. These are Arian stats actually. So Arian said that on the Persian side, 3,000 infantry were killed and 1,000 infantry captured. That's of around somewhere between like 20 to 40,000 men. So that's really small percentage. Many more of them just run away than are killed by orders of magnitude, and Alexander is supposed to have had like 400 killed in total. So that shows it was quite a close fought battle when the casualty figures are quite like similar like that, with like not massively disproportionate. It shows that Alexander really had to fight this one hard, but also that they just flee. So they're not all dead. They could regroup somewhere, they just run away from this particular battle, because that was actually a way of surviving a battle if you were losing.
Well, yeah. I mean, how many times would people have to make that split-second decision, whether to run or not, whether that is going to cause their immediate death, or whether they might actually flee and make it off the field and live to see another day? I mean,
well,
I hope I'm never find myself in that situation.
It's not the same as modern warfare where everyone's got guns, right? It's like you see this with a lot of stuff, like with Alexander, with Socrates and Alcibiades, where Alcibiades gets wounded in a battle and Socrates stands in front of him defending him from people, because you are you are not just being shot at and one shot kills. It takes a lot to kill a guy who's in armor and fighting back. It takes a long time to kill that guy because you've got to defeat him. You have to wear him down. You have to, make sure that his defense are down so you can stab him in the neck or whatever, or stab him in the crotch or whatever it is, because he's armored. So you can't just, you can't just murder him with one shot or anything. So this is one of the reasons that people could actually just run away. It's like you throw down your shield and your spear and then you just flee. And then if you're carrying a shield and spear, it's difficult to catch that guy, man. That's why they needed cavalry. I mean, a lot of the time these guys are running for all they're worth. How long, you run for a mile, you're like, you know what, let that guy fucking go, I've got his spear and his shield. Just tell them, So it's just interesting. It's important to remember the sort of differences. It was a genuinely different beast in an ancient battle.
Yeah. And we wish we knew more about exactly the dynamic or how it actually played out, the physical reality of how that would go. You can debate it forever, really.
Well, the closest thing you get these days are the police actions, where it's the police in, like, with their big plastic shields and truncheons or whatever, wearing the perspex armor. That's about the closest approximation. So you see, like, the South Korean police videos where they're just imitating Roman tactics, running around, and you think if you saw that in a battlefield, man, it would be very effective. It would be very effective. And I'm sure I said this in a previous one that we did, that, like, I always think, Christ, man, going to a battle, like, you'd be terrified. But then I was thinking, well, maybe if I was wearing armor and a helmet and had, like, loads of other armored up fighting guys next to me, maybe I would feel quite brave. Maybe I'd be like, actually, fuck this. We can do this. Like, maybe you would feel like you had a good chance of survival,
Yeah, and especially if you'd done it before, and it wasn't your first rodeo. You knew what was coming, and it was also sort of the culmination of your life in many ways. You'd been brought up to do this. There's a lot of soldiers' accounts, probably more special forces type guys, but they're just chomping at the bit to see some action. They're like, please, that's what I signed up for. That's what I want to do. That's what my life is about. No, I'm not scared. Just give me that chance. Let me at them, sort of thing.
No, absolutely. Because I watched the documentary a while ago that essentially there's a part of men's brains that enjoys fighting. It's a high, and so, like, something like 18% of the population get a thrill from fighting. Like, there's a joy to it, and this was, I can't remember the name of the Roman author, but he had, something like, out of every 100 men, only 10 of them are the real fighters. And out of those 10, only one man is going to be the man who brings them all home. Like, so 90 of the men on the battlefield don't really want to be there. They're not like natural, men who go out and look for fights, and then out of that 100, 10 of them would be those kind of rough types who like hurting people, who like being in fights. And, like, say, they were looking forward to having a fight. We're going to go beat these guys up. This is going to be bad for them. It's going to be great for us. This is going to be great. We're going to kick their asses, take their stuff, and have take their wives as slaves. We're going to win big from this. So like the assumption that you'd be afraid because you're looking at, like, World War II and stuff, where that's gone. The gun has erased that completely. And then you think back to how it might have been in past eras. If you're a capable fighter and you're armored up, you might be thrilled about battle. You probably couldn't wait.
Yeah, it's sort of the culmination of everything you've ever wanted. It's weird because I'm not like that. Like, I've never really wanted to be in the army particularly, but you hear lots of accounts of people that say, all he ever wanted was to be in the Marines, and he was the happiest I've ever heard him when he was out on deployment. There are guys like that, that again, maybe special forces guys that have seen many firefights, and they're begging for another chance to go back into it. And some say Alexander, this is sort of a grander theme of Alexander's character or his life, but many people have said that Alexander may well have, that was his thing. He sort of got off on campaigning and combat even more than anything, even more than drink and partying and sex or anything. What he loved, what he was in love with, was campaigning and taking cities and winning glory.
But I completely agree. I completely agree. Like, but this has been a long known thing through history, like, just like the whiskey in the jar, right? The song Whiskey in the Jar. Like it's an old folk song, and in it, it's like some men just live to hear the cannon roaring. It's like yes, some men do live for battle. There's I think there's a condition, a part of the human condition, and it's just that's something that is a part of being human. Some people love war. I mean,
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
but the thing is, like, we're essentially doing the same thing by proxy. If we'd grown up in a cult, I mean, we're interested in this just for the sake of it, right?
yes, folks, yeah.
But if we lived 2,000 years ago in Greece, we'd probably go and do it as well for the sake of it. If we're so inclined to even pay this kind of attention and appreciation to it, it just we happen to be modern, soft bourgeois men. So
I think Dan Carlin says it more than once actually when he says, just the thing that is interesting are the extremes of like the human experience, like the real extremes, whatever that is, of anything that involves death or sex. You're just interested in it, right? I mean, because why not? and anything like Alexander, the campaigns of Alexander, it really is so extreme, so on the limit of again, I don't know why I keep going back to it, but the accounts of special forces missions. It's like you're sitting there in your armchair, and it's so far away from your immediate reality, from your life, from your day-to-day life, that it's compelling. Yes, it's ultra violent. Yes, it may be amoral, but it's interesting. I'm afraid, and
it is.
To deny that would probably be the weirder thing to do.
Yeah, I mean it's weird to us, but it was their day job. You know what I mean? Like this is what they did as their career. They literally some of the same men would have gone all the way across and then back. And like this whole thing about it being violent, it's like well, yes, human history has been very violent. Like there's no like the Persians were no less violent when they were conquering the empire to start with. Alexander didn't generally go around sacking cities for the crack. He didn't. He was surprisingly mild in many regards. So he was conquering an empire because of the illegitimacy in his view of the emperor, of the Persians themselves, because of what they'd done to Greece. Like it wasn't that he hated the people there and he wanted to eradicate them or anything. I don't know. That's the game. You can't say that he's bad for playing it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I don't consider Alexander particularly more bloody than many other warlords from that period at all. There are certainly some things that, by a modern standard, are war crimes, but that's just an anachronism. They weren't war crimes. He was a man of his time, and if a city is given an option to surrender and doesn't, well, the rules are that you will then be sacked, which then Alexander did do a number of times. But he's a man of his time. It's
that's
silly
what everyone did.
As bloodthirsty as he was, I don't consider him any more cruel or unusual than anyone else of his time.
No, and there are definitely examples where you could consider him more lenient and humane as well. Like especially the scope of the opportunity that Alexander had to do damage to people and to loot and burn and stuff. Considering that most commanders don't get the opportunities Alexander got, and he didn't take them all. He was restrained in some regards, definitely.
Yeah, we'll talk about looting and burning. He goes on down the coast of the Ionian coast. Like Sardis surrenders. He goes past Pergamum and Smyrna and Ephesus is one where Ephesus is liberated in inverted commas. And
what did he do at Ephesus?
Well, they held out. They didn't immediately surrender, and when he does get inside relatively quickly, there's a load of killings. Well, it's going to be a full Thebes-style massacre, but Alexander actually does intervene and stops that from happening.
See, now there's one of the examples. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do it.
Yeah, apparently that went a long way as well. A lot of the other cities around sort of got wind of that and were like, "Oh, okay, he is a conquering, a conquering warlord, but he's not an insane psychopath." So apparently that did actually go quite a long way, that he prevented those massacres from continuing. But he goes on after that to Miletus, which also holds out, and there's some sort of small scale trying to besiege it, blockade it from the sea, and there's some wranglings over what the strategy is going to be. Should Alexander keep any sort of navy or not? Because he's going to be going down all the way the coast, all the way down to that whole eastern side of the Mediterranean. Is it worth keeping and maintaining a naval force? And Alexander decides, in the grandest sense, that it's not worth it. He's going to conquer the ships from the land. In other words, take all of the coast, and any sort of Persian navy will become redundant because they've got nowhere to put in. That he will defeat their navy that way, which is quite a bold strategy.
But didn't they have some kind of fleet to start with that Memnon defeated?
Yeah, so there's Nearchus comes up a few times throughout the story, and he's sort of perennially Alexander's naval commander. And at the beginning, in this early stage of the war, of the campaign, they're pretty weak at sea, it doesn't turn until they get to Tyre, a bit later on, does the worm turn, so to speak, when the Greek side, their navy, or the Phoenicians, a lot of the Phoenicians switch sides from the Persian coalition to the Greek coalition, and apparently that's the real decider. That puts all the it gives the impetus to the Greek side at that point. But no, you're right. At this stage, Alexander isn't really interested in maintaining much of a fleet at all.
Sorry, Karen. I was just googling Memnon. It was later on that he becomes a thorn in his side. Sorry, I was jumping ahead a bit there.
Yeah, well, there's just plenty of sieges at this point. There's all sorts of siege engines. Alexander loves a siege engine. This is you get the feeling that this army is a lot more like a Roman army than it is like the armies that you see in the Peloponnesian War, the sense that in the sense that their formations seem a lot better, a lot more disciplined, and they've got loads of machines and siege engines, and Alexander will just order a giant earthwork or something, and it will get done really quickly. He will just order a really massive wooden palisade, and boom, it's suddenly been done, and it just sounds like a Roman army in some ways,
Well, I think rather than comparing it to a Roman army, I would say what it is a professional army, because the Assyrians had very much the same sort of thing, and they had a standing army at like 1000 BC, roughly around there. I think it was Tiglath-Pileser that first created the second that created the Assyrian standing army, and the professional troops are just so much better than levies, part-time troops. It's kind of scary to watch. And this sort of stuff is all characteristic of that. Some of the Assyrian siege engines are legendary. When you look at the go to the British Museum, I went there the other day actually, and the Assyrians, like they're such a warlike people, and almost all of their art is either them hunting lions or taking cities. And it's just like you see these giant walled Middle Eastern cities, and then the Assyrians have got this huge, this battering ram siege tower combination that just they roll up to the walls with it's got archers on top firing into the defenses, and then it just starts battering down the walls because it's got this huge battering ram on it, and it's just like. And at the same time, the Greeks had nothing like this. This is like 700 BC. These were created, and then when you get to the Persian invasion of Greece and the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks are terrible at taking cities. They're terrible at taking cities, and they essentially they're just really really subpar on their siegecraft. But they're not professional armies. They're all armies of recruits, volunteers from the manpower of the city, not like professional soldiers who are recruited to fight alone. And so the Macedonian army really distinguishes itself in this regard by being a professional army rather than an army of volunteers. It's so noticeable how much better the army gets and how much more competent. And like you say, with the Romans, with the amount they could build, like the Assyrians did the same with, they just put massive earthworks up against the city walls and stuff like this. It's like, Christ, man, these guys are genuinely capable because they spend all day, every day being soldiers.
Yeah. Like Alexander will order like a siege tower, and it seems it's immediately built, or more than one. And it's described as being massive and like really sort of elaborate and all sorts of things, and expertly done because they've done it many times before, and it just seems like a world away from from Thucydides'
Yeah, yeah,
Thucydides
yeah, yeah,
accounts of sieges, you know.
yeah, yeah.
And so
No,
they carry on all the way. Oh, sorry, go on. Sorry.
yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and they have like professional engineers and things with professional armies. You know, have like different corps of types, and then you've got like 30,000 troops at your disposal. So it's like, right, send 10,000 men to go chop down one tree each, and you've got all of the resources you need to build the siege engine. You know, so these things could be built with remarkable speed by comparison.
Yeah, and one of the things maybe it might be worth saying right now is that in an army as we know it, is that you've got sort of generals and, you know, all sorts of ranks of officers under that, and then, you know, non-commissioned officers, and then the men. And you stick to your rank. But what it seems Alexander had is he had sort of a pool of general officers, and whatever the need was, and he knew some were better at certain things than others. So if he needed guys that were going to be sort of scouts to go ahead and ford a river, say, and he knew that a certain general was great at that, he'd pick him that day to do that. Or if he knew there was one general whose men were great at scaling cliffs, or he knew one general was great and his men were great at building siege towers, and you know, they reach somewhere like Halicarnassus, and there's going to be a big siege, and he's like, right, you're my general this week. You're in charge of a huge body of men. You're going to have them at your disposal for a certain amount of time, and that seemed to work really well. That you just pick the right guy for the right job instead of the same guy being the general the whole time.
Yeah, it's interesting that gives a general amount of competence and recognition amongst the army, because it's easy to imagine that if like with the Persian army, where they raise ethnic units, you know, so you've got the Persians, you've got the Egyptians, the Syrians, you know, like all of these different ethnic units. So there's no way a Persian an Egyptian commander would be able to talk to the ones from Afghanistan, so the horsemen from Afghanistan or whatever, you know, the Scythians or whatever it is. You know, they've got absolutely no cultural connection, no understanding of what each other are doing or, you know, why they're doing it. So they're very atomized in that way. Whereas in an army like Alexander's, like the way he's doing it, the rotation, the command of units would have been by rotation. You know, like we need someone to command that unit today, and we've got Ptolemy off doing something else, scouting or whatever it is he did. You know, so you're going to have to fill in for him because that unit still needs to be commanded, and not necessarily in a battle, but just like, you know, organized. You know, and like, you know, this is this task of this unit. You've got to go off and do it. So it's interesting how that would have given like a lot of recognition and a cohesiveness to the army. I think that would have really helped.
Yeah, and the way it's described, I think mainly in Arian, is that you know, like I think of maybe casual labourers or casual builders, where very early in the morning, the foreman or the boss picks a few guys, and it seems like it's almost described like every morning outside Alexander's tent, he'd have sort of a general meeting or some sort of town hall with nearly all his generals, and he'd say, today you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing that. And you can imagine the dynamic of that every morning you're like, oh, I hope he picks me. I hope he, you know, or you get jealous of the same guys that always get picked, you know, all that sort of thing. So, no, it is really interesting and just different. It's just different to how we do armies, you know.
Yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it? Very interesting.
And at Halicarnassus, the siege of Halicarnassus is a fairly big one. There's all sorts of trenches getting built and earthworks and towers and catapults and
Halicarnassus had inner walls as well, so taking the outer walls wasn't just taking of the city. And they're very vigorous, the Halicarnassians as well. They sally out and try and drive off the Macedonians multiple times.
Yeah, it's a tough nut to crack.
Really
it's a real ding dong back and forth at Halicarnassus. There's a great anecdote at one point, because it goes on for, I think, quite a few weeks or months, that one, and two Macedonians get drunk at one point and just egging each other on, saying, no, I could storm the wall single-handed. It's like, as if you could, but I bet I could. And in the end they goad each other on to the point where they do just drunkenly, well, almost try and commit suicide, I don't know what, but they try and attack the walls. But it's not a complete failure, and loads of other men join in, and it sort of it snowballs into a full-blown assault on the wall. And I don't think that is the final assault on the wall that captures Halicarnassus, but nonetheless, it's still an important one, and it's a really funny story. And actually not unique. You hear the things like that happen all through history, don't you?
Yeah, the one that springs to mind is oh god, I can't remember the name of the city, but during the Albigensian Crusade, the papal army, the crusading army, turns up in the south of France, and they arrive at the town, and they're not. They're arriving they're just setting up, and everything's, no one's thinking anything of it. And a couple of the French army come over, or the crusading army, like go over a bridge and just start essentially like mooning the city, and like giving them the finger and being like, yeah, fuck you. And about 15 of the lads from the city, so fuck it, we're just going to go out there and beat the shit out of these two guys. And they go out and beat the shit out of these two guys, kill them and chuck them into the river. But by that point, like, more of the camp followers come up to fight them. And then the whole thing snowballs and the gates are open. So they burst in through the gates, and that's it. The city falls on the first day. And they kill everyone in the city. This is where the phrase "kill them all, God will know his own" comes from, because the bishop who's overseeing it, oh god, why is his name suddenly gone as well? Oh god, it wasn't even so long ago I was researching all of this, but he just, oh god, we've got in, we didn't expect it. Who are we going to kill? Everyone. The heretic will go to hell, the Christian will go to heaven. Well, what's the question here? So it is a common thing, because this is the thing, right? Because like a lot of the time, it's really easy to look at history, like these sort of campaigns, as if they're a game of Rome Total War. As if like they're predictable units that do predictable things at all times. And that's the thing, like, people are not necessarily always rational actors, and they do they do things out of emotion. So like with Alexander intimidating the tribesmen by the drilling of the army that allows them to escape. Rationally, that who cares? Let them drill, and then you just do whatever you're going to do. But instead, they get intimidated, and in this case, they get drunk and then have a competition. Like, people act like people throughout history. That's the thing.
Yeah, well put. I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's funny how true that is as well, though. That's not just like a passing observation. It's sort of profoundly true. Well, in the
Arnold and Maori. Sorry, it was Arnold and Maori. I didn't even. I started looking it up because it's pissing me off that I can't get the thing to my head. Like, I don't know why I've got this mental block when I'm thinking of this separately to this stuff. Beziers as well. Beziers. Or Bezier, or however it's pronounced in French. But this is something that's happened lots of times.
There's loads of accounts where someone will just do something weird in the middle of the night, and it causes a panic or a rout, or it just snowballs into a full action, and it all came from some silly, usually drunk soldiers bragging amongst themselves. In the crusade, in the second or third crusade, there's definitely examples, or probably all of them actually. If you read enough, you'll find them. But it's incredible how not rare that is.
Really. And the more undisciplined your army, the more likely it is that some random occurrence is going to fuck everything up.
Or armies will get spooked over sort of nothing.
Or they'll be superstitious, like in the invasion of Sicily, where they decide they're not going to take action because there's an eclipse. It's like, so fucking what if there's an eclipse? Do something. You need to do something,
Well, Alexander is actually quite superstitious, or very superstitious, really. He puts a lot. He does a lot of sacrifices, and he puts a lot of weight into what his seers say. And will actually act sometimes on what they do. But there's another thing. We're getting onto the Gordian bit, the Gordian knot, and it's like the way Alexander deals with that is like the various oracles that he goes to. I feel like this is just my opinion though, but I feel like if you were to visit an ancient oracle, you'd have to deal with it like maybe like a horse. Or somebody who's trying to alpha male you. You've got to sort of stick your chest out, and be the dominant actor. Otherwise, they're going to trample all over you. And I feel like Alexander knew that. Whenever he goes to an oracle, he sort of doesn't really allow them to play mind games with him. He just says, "I want to know this. Give me the answer." And then whatever they tell him, he tries to make it sound positive. Simple as that. He doesn't really, do what he's told as such. And it's
that's
the same with the
interesting.
Gordian knot, where there's this thing that is like a prescient thing that's going to sort of cast a pall or a shadow over his whole campaign. And so, fuck it, you cut it in half. That's it. Just I'm going to deal with it that way,
Well, at least
because I'm
then
not
it's dealt
having this
with, isn't
playing
it?
tricks on me. Sorry.
Then at least it's dealt with. It's not something at his
Yeah.
back, is it? Even if it, I mean, and as soon as you do something, as long as the problem is not there afterwards, it can be debated either way whether it was the right thing to do. That's the thing. But the thing is, with so your view on the ancient oracles is very interesting, and I've I've read more than enough of this to have encountered different oracular predictions from different cultures in different times and with different results. And I always found it weird because it's like you'll have the oracle at Delphi, for example. You have some woman, the Pythia, is it? I think it's the Pythia, who is in the inner chamber, and she has the visions and stuff. And then this is interpreted by the priests and then given as an oracle by the priests. And so I kind of looked at it in a way like political commentary, you know? Like, who are these priests? Do we think for a second that they're not political people? Do we think for a second that they don't, like, because you've got loads of people visiting the oracle, they're going to be asking people for news, and they're going to find out about the political circumstance of all of Greece, what's happening around Greece. And foreign kings come and give, get oracular predictions. And so these are very, very political institutions, these oracles that people come, or famous kings come from miles around you. Everyone comes, everyone, like great and small, from the lowest area of society, they come and give like a few pence or whatever for a curse on their ex-girlfriend or whatever it is. And then to, right up to the highest ranks. So these are very political institutions, and they're bound to have very savvy understanding of the political realm, because that's their job effectively. And so I always viewed them like political insiders or commentaries, like where it's like, look, like the building the wall of wood thing for Athens, right? When Themistocles goes there, it's like, or is it Themistocles who goes there? Or whoever goes there and gets the prediction. They say, right, so build a wall of wood. And so one interpretation is they build a wooden wall on top of the Parthenon, which a bunch of them die behind, But Themistocles' interpretation is that means the wall of wood is a navy that Athens builds to defeat the Persians. And that is politically, because they've just discovered these massive silver mines in the south of Attica. So it's one of those things that the discovery of those silver mines would have been known by the person who gave the oracular prophecy, and effectively they're looking at the situation and going, well, look, we think you're better off if you get a navy. And so effectively it felt like it was kind of political advice or commentary that was being given. That's what I always felt when I was reading through these.
Yeah, I feel like, well, I feel like it's a money making scheme. So you,
Oh yeah.
if you were poor, you got to ask a yes or no question, maybe. And if you were a king or somebody like Alexander or Philip or something, you could give them lots of gold, and you could expect like a decent answer, albeit cryptic, but you could expect a decent long answer about something. But it seems to me the real reality of it, the real, down to earth men like Philip would have known that it was essentially a racket. They probably would have seen, who knows, but seen through it to some extent, that it's these old priests making money and giving cryptic answers, and that it's not.
Well, that's the thing. I think that if you view it only in that light, then it does look like a racket. But I think what essentially they're doing is paying for political advice from the in-the-know political actors, because I mean, your enemies may well have come and given a donation to the oracle themselves at some point. And so what you're doing is you're paying for advice from someone who has some first-hand knowledge of the person you're trying to get advice about, in some circumstances. I think they are political sources. They're sort of like political advisors. And I think that's what you're paying for. I don't think they would have done it if it was just, this is a racket. Someone like Philip of Macedon would never do something like that, So like, I think that they understand there is some value in what they're getting. It's political advice. I think that's what they were paying for.
Yeah, well, there's definitely political. I mean, that's sort of what I was getting at, where Alexander, I feel like Alexander deals with them like you. Okay, so it's politically important what the answer is. It needs to be positive, you know. And so to prevent them from saying anything negative or giving some sort of cryptic answer, which might or might not be negative, in order to prevent that, in order to make sure that sort of the uh, the optics, the narrative are completely in his favour, he doesn't really give them a chance. He'll just say, you know, he just says, well, the Gordian knot is sort of an example of that. It's this portent which may or may not cast a shadow over it. So let's just blast through it. You know, let's
Yeah,
just remove it from being a problem.
yeah, yeah,
And I feel like that's how he deals with oracles. And it's certainly, well, the story of the Gordian knot, if anyone doesn't know, is that there was the old the King Midas, an old wagon from truly ancient times with a knot, a huge giant knot
that
joining
couldn't be
the
undone.
part itself, and it couldn't be undone. Yeah, you couldn't see where the beginning or any end was, and it was ridiculously tight, and no one could undo it. And the prophecy was, and the man that did undo this knot was destined to rule Asia or rule Persia.
Yeah, well,
And
the king
Alexander
of
just
Asia.
right, yeah, yeah. And Alexander, I think, just almost immediately has a bit of a look at it, but just cuts it in half with his sword and says, "There you go, I undid it."
Yeah,
And again, it's one of those things. I think the whole story of the Gordian knot, I believe, may be one of those episodes, one of those anecdotes, which is more on the scale of legend
yes,
than
yes,
outright history. You know, there's certain things where you go, well, that almost certainly happened. There's some archaeological evidence that
yeah.
happened, and that there isn't really anything like that for the Gordian knot, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, are there even any other references to it in literature? Like, I'm not even aware of it being referenced anywhere else. Let me have a quick look.
Yeah, no, but I mean, Rufus, Curtius, and Arrian both mention it though. They both mention that Aristobulus has mentioned it. So, yeah,
Yeah,
who knows? Who knows?
but like outside of the Alexander legend, I've never heard of the Gordian knot. Like,
Oh,
no,
wow.
like I'm just looking now. So, I mean, apparently the ox cart stood at the palace of former kings of Phrygia at Gordium in the 4th century BC when Alexander arrived.
I was
Um,
going to say it'd be a Phrygian story, so pretty
yeah,
obscure.
yeah, like I've never heard of it outside of this. That's the thing, and
Yeah.
I've never I've never seen any references to it outside. And you'd think that there would be something if it was, like even if it was just, this hero tried to undo the Gordian knot and failed to do it, and whatever, like anything like that. But I've not, I've not seen anything outside of it.
Yeah, well, that's why I say it's one of those episodes which is less reliable than others. Should we
Mm,
say that?
mm.
It seems to be one of those things. Look how badass Alexander is. It's just one of those stories made up probably after his death.
Yeah, but I
Who
mean,
knows?
again, I suppose the rebuttal would be, well, maybe it was something that was just of common understanding. There's a knot in Gordia that the king of Asia will one day undo, or something like this. Who knows? I mean, you would think that the Persians would have gone there and heard of this. Like the king of Persia would have been like, well, I'm going to untie that then because I'm the king of Asia. You would think that they would be interested in ingratiating themselves into these myths because there were in other places. They would try and like make themselves seem legitimate that way. So why would a Persian king just pass up the opportunity? If it's sat there in his kingdom anyway, if he's got this great empire and there's a part of it, by the way, if you undo this knot, then you're the legitimate king of Asia. Why wouldn't you want to go and do that? Like that'd be such a PR win. And these guys knew
Yeah.
about PR, so
Yeah, no, my opinion, like personal opinion alert. But I would, if I had to really say, I would say that the whole story of the Gordian knot is probably not true.
yeah, I agree.
It's just too perfect. It's
Yeah,
just too exactly what Alexander or Alexander's
yeah,
successors, who wanted to make him out to seem even
yeah.
more incredible. It just plays into their hands too perfectly.
Yeah, and not
That's what
only
it
that,
feels.
like the mechanics of it, he just cut through the Gordian knot. Really, you've got this giant
Yeah,
rope knot. Man, you're going to be
he had a
hacking through that.
lightsaber.
Yeah, yeah, it's not a lightsaber for Christ's sake. Yeah, I've always been skeptical of this particular story, I have to say. But only yeah, there aren't very many stories in his life I'm actually very skeptical of, to be honest. But this is definitely one that I've always been like, I would like more information and proof about this one, please. But
Yeah.
right, back to the
Yeah, well, they take Halicarnassus in the end,
well,
and again, pretty brutal when they get inside.
yeah, the Memnon of Rhodes and a Persian satrap are also there. The Memnon's under a lot of suspicion by the Persians because he's a Greek and he knew Philip of Macedon, so he's considered. I mean, he's not. Alexander isn't a fan, and he's viewed with a lot of suspicion by the Persians. But the thing is, he's also quite a competent commander, and he is a Greek, so he knows about what the opposition. So you definitely want someone like that. But it was Memnon who decided that that Halicarnassus was lost to Alexander after they'd taken the inner city, the city walls, and then they're breaking through the inner city walls or something like that. And this essentially where Memnon just withdraws to the ships and sails away and burns the city down.
Yeah, and I mean that's a little bit before the Gordian bit, but yeah, that's exactly what happens. And Memnon of Rhodes dies not long after. In through the story of this, he dies, and that seems like well, it's not entirely clear, but it seems like Memnon of Rhodes was like a really quite a competent general. Darius could have done with him. Really could have done with him in the field, and it's sort of quite a loss to Darius because from this point on, the main Persian defense is sort of taken on personally by Darius himself, which, well, in the end wasn't the best thing to have done. It would have been better if you'd had a professional in that role.
Well, yeah. So Memnon was made. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia entry here, but They said that Memnon was made commander of the Western satrapies after the defeat of Granicus, because loads of the Persians died there, being heroic. Loads of the Persian satraps and commanders died there. Actually, I was looking. So out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So of nearly 15 of them, only 3 of them walked away. So Nephates, Patinis, Mithridates, loads of big name Persians die there. And Memnon is one of the people who is there, one of the leaders who is there, who survives. And he's given the command of the Western Front at this point. And he nearly defeats Alexander at Halicarnassus. He nearly inflicts a defeat on him. But they managed to break through the walls with the siege engines and surprise the Persians, and they retreat. But it then goes on saying that he used the empire's naval superiority against Alexander, and he's the one who started negotiations with Sparta to give them the money from the Persians so they would start a revolt against the Macedonians in Greece. So the Persians are taking this seriously already, and Memnon's very competent here. He's a very competent commander.
Yeah, well, I think after the Battle of the Granicus, the Persians, or Darius, is like, oh shit, this is real. This is a proper threat.
Yeah.
And I need to do sort of everything in my power to anything I can now to actually face this threat. It's not.
Yeah.
I can't just leave it to my Western generals to deal with. This is a true existential threat to us. And Memnon of Rhodes is sort of my best guy, certainly out there. And so I'm going to need to lean on him pretty heavily. But and as we said, Antipater puts down any sort of revolts in Greece itself, mainland Greece. So that ultimately doesn't work.
Yeah, but you're right. So he dies during the siege of Mytilene. I'm not sure. It doesn't tell me exactly when, though.
It's around this stage, or in Arian. He dies before he gives the story of the Gordian knot.
Does he?
Yeah, so it's relatively early on that Memnon dies. However, having said that, Arian does play around with the chronology of things a little bit. He usually lets you know when he's doing that. But he doesn't say everything in perfect chronological order. Nevertheless, it's around this time. Well, by the time Alexander and his army come back down from central Turkey, which is where Gordium is, when he comes back down to the coast, to sort of the Sicilian gates and Tarsus and around that part of the world, I think Memnon of Rhodes is already dead by that point.
Right. Because it is a genuine stroke of luck for Alexander, because Memnon, he's in the middle when he dies. He's begun a campaign to recapture the Aegean Islands using the Persian fleet. He led a direct assault on Macedonia while Alex was at Phasaelis. He captures the island of Chios, most of Lesbos, and Demosthenes, after hearing of Memnon's successes, begins to prepare Athens for a revolt against Alexander with other Greek cities while Sparta's preparing for their war. And by a stroke of fortune, it's around that time that Memnon dies during the siege of Mytilene. So that, like, Memnon would have been an absolute nightmare for Alexander had he continued to live. And very, very lucky for Alexander that he dies at this point.
Yeah, I think Alexander would have actually relished the chance to meet Memnon of Rhodes on the field. That's just how Alexander was, and that would
undoubtedly, yeah,
written in the stars that they were never going to actually get that.
But do you want to know something interesting? Memnon's widow becomes a mistress of Alexander's and bears him a son.
Oh, really? What's her name? Does it say?
Barsine, Barsine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just like his dad, he took many wives throughout his life.
Yeah. Well, she was a mistress, so you know.
All right, yeah. Well, it's around this time, after they get through the Cilician gates and down in Tarsus, that part of the world, Alexander gets ill, actually. He catches some sort of chill, or he catches some sort of a fever, actually, something like that, and gets really quite deathly ill or close to it. And I've probably said on nearly a lot of my videos that that thing that in the pre-modern era, you could be perfectly healthy grown man and catch something and die all within a few days. That can totally happen, and there's a bit that happens with Alexander, but he recovers. Of course. It's probably from swimming. He goes swimming in really cold water, and I suppose you can just catch a chill that way. I suppose.
I guess even in Turkey you can catch a chill. I've been to Turkey. It's hot as hell. Like, I don't know.
Yeah,
these bloody
Turkey,
weak Greeks with their weak, sunny constitution. Sorry, go on.
Well, there's one story at this point where he's really quite ill, and these doctors think they need to intervene. They need to do something, give him a tonic or a tincture of something. And his doctor whips together some sort of potion that's going to bring Alexander back from the point of death. And just before Alexander's going to take this medicine, he gets a message from Parmenio, one of his, greatest generals, most trusted, ultra. And the letter says, "Don't trust your doctor. Don't take anything he gives you. He's trying to poison you. Beware." And so what Alexander does, he just drinks the medicine immediately right in front of the doctor, and then passes the doctor this note and lets the doctor read it. In other words, Alexander is saying, "I have complete faith in you." This doctor has been his doctor since childhood. He's known this guy forever, and as a testament of how much he does have faith in him, that's what he does. But again, it's just one more example of how Alexander is kind of fearless, or really prepared to die a lot, and he's just really brave and has like this code. This moral code, which he really is prepared to stand and live and die by. It's a great little story, I think.
And it's very interesting how it's about trust and loyalty. It's like but I really, really agree with you on this. He is consistently portrayed as being totally fearless, and I mean, like, in many ways, you could say, like, you could argue that he's kind of enamored with his own legend and glory, even at this point, as if he's so convinced he has a destiny to fulfill that he can take reckless actions, and he has faith that he'll be fine. It's kind of wild, man.
Yeah, I mean, that is part of trying to emulate Achilles. That's part of it, is that you are sort of aware of your own mortality and glory and fame and all these things all at once while you're doing it, which is well, I mean, it is what it is. But Alexander really, if you believe all the accounts, he was really, really honest to God, trying to recreate that and do that, and that the other people in his life were the other characters in the Iliad. That Hephaestion is like Patroclus, or that Darius is something like Priam or Hector or something, and it's sort of, it seems to us, or to our modern mind, it seems to sort of, I think, brilliant and incredible and also insane really. Sort of all those things at the same time, or it's just different. I think, as you said in one of our other videos, that the past is a foreign country. Things are done
Totally.
differently there.
Yeah.
Things are done differently there, and you can try and wrap your mind around it. I remember one of my lecturers at uni saying something about the Roman Republic. At some point, he just stopped himself mid-sentence and sighed, and said, "Look, you can't truly understand what they thought. You can't really get inside the mind of in this instance, he was talking about the first century AD Romans, but we talk about third century BC. You can't hope to truly get inside their mind and understand how they thought. Not properly. You would have had to have had their upbringing and experienced their world. You can only really hope for glimpses at it or a degree of understanding. And I think that's what you have to say about Alexander and his companions. It's difficult to truly appreciate what they were thinking and why they did what they did.
Yeah, because there's a kind of way of looking at history that is essentially not credulous, and so we think, well, Alexander believed in Zeus or Ares, Achilles, whoever, but Alexander, to him, that was as real as science is real to us. Because if tomorrow someone came around and said, actually, by the way, all of this science stuff, it actually turns out not to be true. I'm from the future. We actually figured out that it's actually this, and this. So there's no such thing as gravity. You're not breathing oxygen, but you'd be like, what? That's, you're lying. You wouldn't believe it because it would be, the total opposite of your own worldview. And so, Alexander taking these stories as literal stories and genuinely believing them, this turns him into someone who genuinely believes that his fame will be written through the ages. And I mean, to be fair, it kind of was. So, I mean, where's the lie? But he believes in this spiritual and supernatural aspect to his own life. They believe in curses. They believe in magic. They believe in gods. They believe that great stories can genuinely be written into the tapestry of human history. And so, he takes, like you say, he is very brave because he's like, no, I'm going to do this, and so, but it's hard to understand from our perspective, I'm probably not doing it any justice either.
Yeah, no, I think you are. There's one other small point, maybe it's not a small point, but a tweak on what we're just saying is that actually Alexander didn't really want to emulate Achilles. He wanted to surpass him. He wanted to surpass him. He wanted to surpass Philip. He wanted to surpass any human man that had ever lived. And it's Cyrus the Great, all these people, Xerxes the First. He wanted to be the best around. I mean, a bit of armchair psychology, you could say that's megalomania, that's just a giant, some sort of out of control Napoleon complex, or whatever you want to say, put modern words on it. But it was certainly just the way he was raised. You can imagine Aristotle saying these are what the heroes in the Iliad did. This is what men do, and it's the correct thing to conquer peoples if you're capable of doing it. That's not megalomania. That's not insanity. That's sort of the correct way to act. Yeah,
it's manly. Yeah, and again, right, all of our opinions on these things come from our own upbringing and our own safety, because there are so many people and just peoples. Groups of people, ethnic groups that just no longer exist. They just don't exist. And you can name them all over the world. In every country, there are ancient tribes or, empires and whatnot of countries that don't even, no one is the descendant of these people as far as they're aware. They don't have any understanding of themselves as being of these people. It's only modern reconstructions that these things come back where into kind of the neo-pagan sort of, where it's like, oh well, the Nazis are the Teutonic, and it's like, yeah, but in the Middle Ages they didn't think of themselves quite like that. This is a modern construction because of our own understanding of the archaeological nature of history that we actually didn't have for hundreds of years. So and that's that all over the world. So there are all these peoples who have disappeared. And they've disappeared because they waged war. Everyone waged war. It's just taking cities was something that happened all the time. Armies, everyone at some point, every man at some point would have been in an army. Every man would have likely fought in a battle. at some point in their lives, maybe only once, but like Socrates is a great example. He's fought in 3 battles that we're aware of on the front lines as a hoplite. It's like, you just don't think of him like that. That's just not being a great warrior is also a part of Socrates's aspect, as a human, because it was just a different world, man.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not that long ago we had national service. I mean, really, I think Parkinson did national service. Like in Greece, they still have it. In Israel, it's men and women. Today.
What I mean though is, yeah, but national service is a bit different because it's mandatory. Like, what I mean is the muster. I mean, like in England, like the Scots were raiding down into England at least till about 400 or 500 years ago. So like, on slave taking operations. So if you lived in Yorkshire, there was a good chance that any given year that a huge horde of like 20,000 angry Highlanders would come down, try and kill you and rape your wife. So at any point, any given year, in the beginning of the year, you'd be waiting for the call to muster to arms to go and fight off an incursion of some barbarian horde that are just coming down. And this happens all the time. Like, there's an enormous one after Alexander in the 3rd century BC that the Macedonians do turn back. And the same thing happens in Italy as well. At the same time, it's this giant like tidal wave, and obviously that's they're unusual that big, but 20,000 barbarians wandering into your land, that's not that unusual. That happens an awful lot, in fact. It's concerning stuff.
Yeah, I think our generation, and maybe the boomer generation as well, sort of knowing for a fact that you're not going to be called upon to fight in a war. That's like an important part of your psychology,
Yeah.
Or put it the other way, knowing for a fact that you are almost certainly going to have to serve, will just create a different person, wouldn't it? If you've been told that from the earliest age, that, well, the way we were raised, just told as a given that you're not going to be sort of really asked to be an infantryman and suffer under a bombardment. I mean, that does make us soft, doesn't it? I mean, you can't really
I don't have a spear and shield. Like every man would have had a spear and shield, especially say in England with the third, the muster, or longbow, whatever it is. Like every man was trained in arms to some degree, and we're just not.
Well, I mean, if the Battle of Culloden is the 18th century, isn't it? I mean, it's not that long ago.
No, it's really not.
Was sort of put down for the last time.
But rampaging barbarian armies was just something that happened in the ancient world, because the world had not been as pacified as it is now. Like not everywhere had a state. And sometimes these barbarian armies could get absolutely colossal and do some unbelievable amount of damage. So it was a scary world, the ancient world. It was not safe and pacified or anything like this. Anyway, sure.
Yeah.
So we're coming up to the Battle of Issus now, then, because
sorry, go on. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, no, go on.
Well, no. Well, I was just going to carry on the narrative. I was just going to say that so like after Tarsus, I suppose, or after Alexander gets that illness, one of the things that you have to sort of bear in mind is that this is a giant army, and he sends some of his lieutenants off all the time. So like Hephaestion or Parmenio are often not with Alexander. They're off ahead or off to the flank and doing all sorts of different things, so that wherever Alexander goes, he's sort of like maybe the flagship or a carrier inside a carrier group. I think of him sometimes like that. Like Alexander's personal bit of the army is just in the center of many army groups. Maybe, and so wherever he goes, there's already been part of the army has already been ahead and made a bridge or finished the bridge or that sort of thing. So he sends some of his generals into Assyria and some off to just other places. Like there's a bit where Arrian talks about how Ptolemy personally kills some chieftain somewhere. And there's bits where Alexander puts on games. They do that quite a lot as well. There's offerings and games put on all the time. That's like sort of after any sort of big set piece, they'll have some games, which is kind of nice. But yeah, we get into the point where, so Darius, as we said earlier, Darius realizes that he can't ignore this. He's got to deal with it himself.
So he's obviously raised a giant army.
Yeah, giant army, right? I mean, so this is one of the two big battles. And
Yeah.
it's sort of a serendipitous thing where they're both trying to meet. Darius and Alexander both want a standing battle, but there's sort of a mountain range between them, and they pass each other. And Darius actually comes around behind Alexander, and Alexander has to double back on himself a
Yeah.
bit. But one of the key things, one of the headlines to take away from the Battle of Issus, is that it ended up being fought on this sort of coast road. There's like the sea, a strip of land about 2 miles wide, and then a mountain range, and that 2 mile strip that's not very much. That's not very wide, and
No.
so. And so Darius's giant army can't use its huge numerical advantage. They can't use it. They can both have battle lines that stretch across that 2 mile-ish plain, and that's one of the
Comfortably as well.
yeah, and so that's one of the main things to mention about this battle.
Yeah, and that should give you some idea of the scope of what these battles were like as well. Like 2 miles is not enough, you know. Like these armies, they are giant armies with huge ranks of men, and like like you say, like the Persian army is very deep because of the confined space. Like 2 miles wide is a confined space, and it's hard to envisage that sometimes, you know. And so when you get to like something like Thermopylae, where it's only a few hundred meters, or whatever, you really get an impression for just how small a defile that becomes. And you always forget how difficult it is to order or maneuver. Because again, like I'm sure that a lot of people listening to this will have played Rome Total War, and it feels very intuitive and very quick to do things with your men, but it really wasn't like that on a battlefield. Essentially, it was very difficult to issue any kind of orders in the middle of a battle, and it had to be like this is what the advantage of professional armies is, that they would be trained to do this. This is why the Romans were so good. It's not necessarily that their soldiers were actually better fighters than anyone else, because they probably weren't. But they definitely were very much better coordinated, and that's a huge advantage. But yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to add that on there for anyone listening.
Yeah, no, you're quite right.
Right.
They have to make a battle plan the night before and stick to it. Everyone has to know their role and do that the next day. And everything relies on you fulfilling your role, even if you can't see what's going on the other side of the battlefield. You just have to hope that everyone's doing their job correctly. And well, the night before, it's not really lost on anyone that this is a key moment. The battle that's coming the next day will be truly, an important one for all of their lives, for the whole campaign, for the future of Asia and Europe. And Alexander gives speeches to his sort of general staff. It's actually one at this point where Parmenio says he sort of pisses Alexander off a bit, because they get an offer. This is one of 2 or 3 times when Alexander gets an offer from Darius, basically tried to pay him off to go away. Maybe you can have a big chunk of my land let's not do this. And Parmenio says to Alexander, maybe we could think about that. It's not crazy. And Alexander,
were I Parmenio, I would accept. Yeah.
That's
but I am
one.
Alexander.
That's the one, yeah. Parmenio
says
says maybe I would accept it, and Alexander's like, well, if I were you, maybe I would, yeah. But
it's such a bitch slap as well.
Yeah. I was going to say, yeah.
Put the claws away.
But in my case, Mama didn't raise no bitch, so I'm just gonna go balls to the wall first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Well, that's another thing. Parmenio says, all right then. Well, if we're going to do it, let's attack them in the night. And Alexander's like, no, don't you get it? I want to do this one-on-one properly.
Yeah, maybe if I were
Parmenio.
We're going to beat him at his strongest, to prove that we're the better men. And that's what he's saying,
Yeah. And the next day comes, and Alexander gives a sort of a rousing speech to his men. Remember, this is what it's all about. This is what we play for, guys. This is what. Remember how they've screwed us over for a couple of 100 years or more, and how they would, just remember all the wrongs they've done us, basically, and that, we can't lose. There's no way back for us. We have to be victorious here. There's no second bite of the cherry for us. So,
I always picture that speech just someone at the front going, "What, you mean like burning down Thebes?" No, shut up.
But it's the classic thing. It's like remember your
Yeah.
families, all that stuff.
Yeah. Remember all the damage they did to Greece? What, like burning Thebes? Shut up. Like the angry NPC meme, you know?
Yeah.
Like Alexander the angry NPC. No. But yeah, no. So the Battle of Issus is a really interesting one.
Yeah, and it's been studied a great deal. I mean, again, this has been
All
poured
of
over by almost every generation of men since it happened have talked
Yeah.
about the Battle of Issus and exactly what happened. It's been
all
done to
all
so much.
military academies do this.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, carry on.
Well, no, I was just going to say it's sort of almost so much of a cliche. I've been done to death so much that, or maybe it's just me that I've oversaturated myself with the Alexander story that the actual details of the Battle of Issus, for some reason, to me, I don't find all that interesting anymore. But ultimately, what it was a great charge by Alexander, and again this thing where the Macedonians are. They're professionals. They're the best of the best professionals. They're led by Alexander, who's got a great eye. Not only does he do tactically the right thing, but his timing is perfect. You know, just as a hole opens up in the Persian line, he's right there, Johnny on the spot, ready to exploit it. You know, perfectly, within a few moments. Really, he knows what he's looking at. You know, that's just invaluable. To actually know what you're looking at and when to strike and when not to, like when to leave, when to not attack, to leave the Persians sort of open all day and they're getting hungry and tired, and all little things like this. But the net result is that the Macedonians are victorious.
Yeah, so the estimates that are given in ancient accounts are 600,000 for the Persians. I agree that's probably wildly overestimated. The later accounts are lower, but the modern accounts are somewhere. I mean, there are estimates like Hansdelbrook gives 25,000, which is tiny. I can't believe that Darius wouldn't be capable of summoning an army more than that, greater than that. But I think 100,000 is probably a reasonable amount at most, because he had the 10,000 immortals and 10,000 Greek mercenaries and apparently 11,000 cavalry. So expecting like 50,000 infantry or so, that I mean that's quite plausible, I think.
Yeah, well, Arian says 600,000, and it seems that that Darius had way more than he could fit into that plane. So I'm prepared to accept hundreds of thousands. Certainly tens and tens and tens of thousands of men and cavalry. Just a huge body of men. Like it's almost like the exact number doesn't really matter.
No.
It's that it's many times more than what Alexander had. You know.
Yeah.
And,
At least like 3 or 4 times more, I would guess. Well, maybe that's too much, but 2 or 3 times. It's definitely a much larger force that the Persians have.
Yeah, and Arian spends quite a lot of time, quite a few pages, just talking about the minute, as I've mentioned earlier, talking about the minutiae of who manoeuvres where and when, and listing all the different battalions.
Yeah,
I mean, or all the different regiments on both sides, and listing loads of people's names that you don't know and don't matter to the story, and all that sort of thing. Classic ancient historian stuff. But yeah, it comes down to after all the manoeuvring. Eventually it's Alexander's the companion cavalry, they're often called. This is like the inner core, like Alexander's innermost loyal, best of the best cavalry type guys that will charge into death at merely a nod from Alexander. These types of guys, and they're the ones that quite often have the decisive role. Well, that's what the accounts tell us anyway. But again, it's one of those things that comes up time and again in ancient Greek literature that the Persians, the Orientals, they're just soft mercenaries who are not used to, who weren't brought up deliberately in hardship, who don't deliberately put themselves through hardships, and that is what will make the difference. And it seems it does. But in the end, Darius has to flee. He flees.
Yes.
He sees the way it's going.
Before we get to that, I think it's important to note that the 10,000 Greek mercenaries that Darius has on the other side are right front and center in the Persian army. They're the center of the Persian line. And they're the bit that give the Macedonians the most stress as well. They have to fight up another bank, a muddy bank, don't they? So it's like it's one of those things where it's like Alexander he seems to be pushing his luck completely, but it was the Hypaspists. I can't pronounce it, but that was the unit I was talking about. Is essentially like a kind of mobile hoplite. But anyway, they managed to punch a hole through the Persian line. Apparently, Alexander is there fighting, in that assault, and then he charges at Darius, and Darius flees, doesn't he?
Yeah, and this is really, a truly heroic thing. Again,
Alexander's a maniac.
Yeah. He's like
he's an absolute maniac.
He's some sort of actual psychopath. When his blood is up, he's like actually a serial killer type. He will chop you up. And this glorious band, the chosen few, by Alexander's side, this companion cavalry, are like maniacs that but they're good at what they're doing. It's not it's a controlled aggression. It's very professional, it seems. It's not just this blind charge, and again, just the individuals seem to be very good at what they're doing. And Darius sort of sees the way it's going and sort of realizes he has to flee. He blames it later a lot on the fact that this relatively narrow bit of ground meant that he couldn't use his numbers, and that's what did for him, and he won't do that again, and that was what was to blame, not the fact that the Macedonians are actually better soldiers than the Persians or anything like that. But he has to flee, and it's really ignominious. It's terrible. He has to leave all his treasures. When the great King of Kings, the Persian King of Kings, travels anywhere, it's with some sort of great entourage,
his wife, his daughters, his riches, his royal court, and the mobile court that they had, with all these tents. Like, this is an amazing capture for Alexander. Like,
Darius's mum,
his mum as well.
It's his whole family and all his treasures, and it's a true humiliation.
It's unreal, actually. It's kind of, Alexander must be like, hang on, I've got his wife and his mother and his daughters. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah. And they say, Arian says 100,000 Persians died at Issus. Maybe not, but certainly a lot of people. It seems a lot of people did die there, one way or another.
Like instead of worrying about the exact number, just the coastal area, this 2-mile area of coast, would have just been littered with bodies. That's they weren't Macedonian bodies. That's the thing. So the estimates for this particular battle that are at least on Wikipedia for the dead is 452 Macedonian casualties, 20 to 40,000 casualties on the Persian side. So 5,000 wounded, but 450 dead. That's considering the numbers of men on either side. That is a storming victory for Alexander, because apparently it's not going well on Alexander's left flank. Just like it's the same at Gaugamela as well. So on his left flank, it's not going that well. And but once he drives off Darius, the rest of the army flees because he sees the commanders run. So. Oh
yeah. It's one of those when the Persian army sees Darius's contingent and entourage flee. That's it. That's it. Their morale absolutely implodes, and they're routed. Yeah. And the road is left open to Damascus, and Parmenio is able to just go on to Damascus and take loads of the treasures that are there. And Alexander's actually wounded in the thigh in this battle. You get one more wound to chalk up. There's many more to go, but he does get wounded there, and he's actually really clement to the captives in this particular instance. Sometimes it almost depends what mood you catch him in. Sometimes Alexander will just order the death of all captives, but this time he's actually quite clement. I think there was lots of captives, and it was just a politic.
He was probably also really pleased with the scope of his victory here. Yeah. You don't need to be bloodthirsty after you've just captured his entire family. I mean, that's for battle 1. That's a pretty good job,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And Darius has to flee all the way. He just flees to the Euphrates, and
Yeah.
and this is a good little episode that comes up where when Alexander, he doesn't immediately, but when Alexander does go into the tent and meets Darius's captured mum and wife and children. Oh, and famously, he treats them really well, makes sure they're not
Yeah.
sort of raped or assaulted or anything, and tries to, treat them with royal dignity still. When he walks in the tent with Hephaestion, who Alexander wasn't apparently all that tall, but Hephaestion was a mountain of a man, apparently, a huge dude. And Darius's mum assumes that Hephaestion is Alexander and bows down to him or prostrates herself before him, saying, "Oh, great king, spare us," or whatever.
Yeah.
And a servant or somebody has to say, actually, it's that little blonde dude who's Alexander. And she can't apologize enough. She's mortified.
Oh,
and
God.
Alexander, yeah, well, you would be, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I love this now. Alexander has short man syndrome.
Yeah. yeah. But Alexander is, they're such good friends, Hephaestion and Alexander. Alexander says, "No, this man is an Alexander.
Yeah.
Me and him are equals. So no need to apologize, sort of thing." And it's again, that's sort of a classic Alexander thing. It's sort of, in other words, it's classic that it's difficult to gauge what his reaction might be to something.
Yeah, it is. It is. He's not a predictable man at all.
No,